He didn't knock. Victor Blackridge shoved the door open so hard it cracked against the wall, and every head in the Millfield land office turned. He walked straight to the counter, slapped a folded paper down hard enough to rattle the inkwell, and said, loudly, deliberately, so the whole room could hear, "This woman is a squatter, a liar, and I want her removed from county records by Friday." The clerk looked at the paper, then at Blackridge, then back at the paper. "Sir, this deed is nothing." Blackridge smiled. "I want it gone." Somewhere behind him, a mother of 4 boys sat in a wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap, watching the most powerful man in Larimer County try to erase her family with a single sentence. She didn't cry. She didn't stand. She just watched him and thought, "You have no idea what you just started. If that were your mother sitting in that chair, what would you do, Ashet?" Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that makes you feel something, please take just a second and hit that subscribe button. We tell stories like this every single week, stories about ordinary people who refuse to break when everything tried to break them. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Evelyn Cross would remember for the rest of her life, not because Tuesdays meant anything special, but because she had spent the entire Monday convinced there would be no more letters. 13 unanswered. 13 ranchers across Wyoming and Montana who had read her careful, honest advertisement in the Prairie Homesteader Gazette and decided, for whatever reason, that a widow with 4 sons was more trouble than she was worth. She had written the truth. That was the part that kept her up at night. She hadn't dressed it up or softened it. She had written, "Widow, 35, 4 sons, ages 8 through 16. Hard worker. Not looking for charity, looking for a fair arrangement for both parties. Boys are healthy and willing." She'd spent a whole evening on those lines, reading them back to herself, making sure nothing in them was a lie. 13 men had apparently decided the truth wasn't appealing enough. So when her youngest, Caleb, came running up the porch steps on that Tuesday afternoon with a wrinkled envelope in his 8-year-old fist, she almost didn't reach for it. She was elbow deep in the wash tub, and her back hurt, and she had already made peace, or told herself she had, with the possibility that the advertisement had been a mistake. "Mama," Caleb held it out. "It's got a Wyoming postmark." She dried her hands on her apron. Slowly. She didn't open it right there. She made herself wait until Caleb went back to playing, until she was alone on the small back step of the boarding house they'd called home for the past 11 months. Ever since Daniel's funeral, ever since the bank had taken the farm in Missouri, ever since the world had made very clear that grief was not a currency anyone accepted. The handwriting on the envelope was plain, capital letters, slightly uneven. Not a man who wrote many letters. Mrs. Evelyn Cross. She opened it. The letter was short. That surprised her. Every other response she'd received, and there had been only 3 actual responses out of 13, the rest being silence, had either been overly formal, reading like a legal contract, or strangely intimate, reading like something a lonely man wrote at 2 in the morning. One had asked for a photograph. One had asked how much money she had left. This one was different. "Mrs. Cross, I read your advertisement twice. I'll be straight with you because I think that's kinder than being careful. I have a working cattle ranch outside Crestfall, Wyoming. It is not a beautiful place right now. It needs work and it needs people who aren't afraid of work. I have been alone here for 3 years since my wife passed, and I won't pretend otherwise. I am not an easy man. I have been told I am too quiet and too stubborn, and both of those things are probably true. What I can offer is a real home, honest work, and my word, which I have never broken once in 41 years. I have no expectations beyond what is fair. If your sons are willing to work, they will be treated with respect. If this arrangement does not suit either of us, I will see you safely back to the nearest town without complaint. I am not writing because I feel sorry for you. I am writing because your letter sounded like someone telling the truth, and I have learned that is harder to find than most people admit. If you're still interested, write back. If not, I understand. Grant Holloway. Holloway Ranch, Crestfall, Wyoming Territory. Evelyn read it 3 times. Then she sat on that back step for a long while, listening to her boys argue somewhere around the corner of the building. Silas's low voice, sharp and irritated. Owen's measured, careful response. The thump of something being thrown and the immediate shriek from one of the twins. She folded the letter along its original crease and held it against her chest. She thought about Daniel, not the way he had looked in the last months, when the sickness had taken most of him, but the way he had been the morning they got married, young and ridiculous and so proud of himself for convincing her. She thought about what he would say if he could see where she was sitting. She thought he probably would have laughed, which is what he did when he didn't know what else to do. She thought about Missouri, about the bank officer who had not met her eyes once during the entire foreclosure conversation, about the way the neighbors had helped, genuinely, generously for 2 months. And then the help had tapered off, the way all help eventually does, and suddenly she was a problem to be managed rather than a woman to be known. 4 sons, 16, 13, 11, and 8. 4 boys who needed to eat, needed boots that fit, needed to stop watching their mother's face when she thought they weren't looking. She stood up, went inside, and wrote back to Grant Holloway that same evening. Silas Cross found out about the letter the same way he found out about most things his mother tried to keep from him, by being in the right place at the wrong time. He was coming down the narrow boarding house stairs when he heard her at the writing desk in the corner of their shared room, heard the particular scratch of her pen that meant she was writing something she cared about, not just a list or a note. He paused at the bottom of the stairs. He was 16, and he had been the man of this family for 11 months, and he took that seriously in a way that sometimes made him miserable. He had Daniel Cross's dark hair and his mother's stubbornness, and a temper he'd mostly learned to keep buried, mostly. "Who are you writing to?" he asked. His mother didn't startle. She never startled. "A rancher in Wyoming." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when someone says something they knew would land hard and waits to see how it lands. "Which one?" Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. "His name is Grant Holloway." She kept writing. He responded to the advertisement. Silas came the rest of the way down the stairs. He stood next to her, not behind her. He wasn't the kind to read over someone's shoulder, but next to her, where she could see him and he could see her face. "You're not going to show me the letter he sent?" "No." "Why not?" "Because you'll make a judgment before you've met the man." "I might be right." She looked up at him then, and there was something in her face that was not quite sadness and not quite determination, something in between, something that existed in the specific territory of a woman who had been surviving long enough that surviving had become its own kind of exhaustion. "Silas," she said, "I need you to trust me." He wanted to argue. He had a dozen things ready. The stories he'd heard about mail-order arrangements gone wrong, the fact that they didn't know this man from a fence post, the fact that Wyoming was the edge of the known world, as far as he was concerned. He had all of it ready. He looked at his mother's hands. The knuckles were cracked from the wash tub. There was an ink stain on her right forefinger that hadn't washed out in 3 days. "I'm not going to stop you," he said finally. "I know. I'm just telling you I don't like it. I know that too." He went back upstairs without another word, and Evelyn turned back to her letter, and neither of them mentioned it again until the train tickets arrived 2 weeks later. Owen was the second oldest and the one who read everything. He was 13, with his father's long-fingered hands and a brain that worked in systems. That was how Evelyn had always thought of it, Owen's mind as a system of organized rooms where everything had its place. When she told him about Wyoming, he asked 4 questions in rapid succession, all of them practical, none of them emotional, and then he went to the bookshelf in the boarding house parlor and looked for anything he could find about Wyoming territory. He found 2 things. Neither of them was encouraging. "The winters are severe," he reported the next morning at breakfast, in the same tone a Weather Bureau officer might use. "I'm aware," Evelyn said. "The ranch economy is unstable. Cattle prices fluctuate significantly based on the railroad access and—" "Owen," she set down her coffee, "are you trying to talk me out of it or just making sure I know what I'm walking into?" He considered this with more seriousness than the question deserved. "The second one," he said. "Good. Then thank you. Eat your eggs." He ate his eggs, but she could see him working through something behind his eyes, cataloging, organizing, building a room in his mind for Wyoming and Grant Holloway, and what happens if this goes wrong. The twins, Eli and Caleb, 11 and 8, took the news in the way that only children their age can take news that would terrify most adults, with immediate and absolute enthusiasm. Eli wanted to know if there would be horses. Caleb wanted to know if there would be a dog. Neither of them asked about the man they would be living with, which said something either about their confidence in their mother or their fundamental inability to think that far ahead. Evelyn was grateful, in that particular tired way, for both possibilities. The train ride to Wyoming was 3 days. By the end of the first day, Silas had positioned himself at the window seat like a sentinel and was watching the landscape change with the focused attention of someone cataloging potential threats. By the end of the second day, Owen had filled 12 pages of a small notebook with observations, calculations, and questions. Eli had made friends with the conductor. Caleb had fallen asleep against Evelyn's arm and didn't wake up for 4 hours, and she sat very still with his weight against her and thought about everything she'd left behind and everything ahead and tried to make it add up to something that felt like courage. It didn't quite, but it was close enough. There was a woman across the aisle who had been watching them, not unkindly, just the particular watching of someone older who recognizes something. She was maybe 65, with a wool coat and the unhurried posture of a woman who had already decided not to apologize for taking up space. "Heading west?" she said to Evelyn, somewhere in the middle of the second day. "Wyoming territory." The woman nodded. "Family there?" "We're building one." Evelyn said it quietly so the boys couldn't hear over the noise of the train. The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and produced 2 hard candies wrapped in paper and held them out. "For the little ones," she said. It was such a small thing, such a thoroughly unremarkable gesture. Evelyn almost cried. She had gotten very good at not in the past 11 months, but she felt it rise and she pressed it back down and smiled and said thank you and thought about how strange it was that small kindnesses were the ones that nearly undid you. Crestfall, Wyoming was not what she had imagined. She hadn't let herself imagine much, which was its own protection, but the town that materialized outside the train window was smaller and more wind-worn than even her conservative expectations. 2 main streets, a general store, a post office, a saloon that looked like the most prosperous building in the county, a church with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left, as though it had been arguing with the wind for years and the wind was winning. The platform was nearly empty when they stepped off. A porter. 2 cowboys leaning against the wall who watched them with undisguised curiosity. An older woman in a dark dress who squinted at them and then turned away. Evelyn stood on the platform with Caleb's hand in hers and her carpet bag at her feet and looked up and down the length of Crestfall's main thoroughfare, and for one terrible moment she thought, "He's not coming." This was a mistake. 13 unanswered letters, and now 1 more. Then a wagon came around the corner from the far end of the street. The man driving it was not what she had imagined either. She had constructed in her mind a composite rancher built from dime novels and cautious hopes. Solid, perhaps, weather-beaten, probably bearded. Grant Holloway was all of those things, but the sum of them was different from what she had expected. He was tall, even seated, with the particular stillness of a man who didn't fidget. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that had clearly sustained at least 1 break and healed slightly crooked. He drove the wagon with 1 hand, the other resting on his knee. He pulled up alongside the platform and set the brake, and then he looked down at them. His eyes went first to Evelyn, then to the boys, Silas first, because Silas was the one standing closest to his mother, shoulders slightly forward, that unconscious protective posture he'd developed in the months after Daniel died. Then Owen, who was watching him with the calm assessment of someone taking measurements. Then Eli, then Caleb. 4 boys. 4 very different faces, all watching him. He climbed down from the wagon. He was taller standing than he'd looked sitting. He walked to where Evelyn stood and stopped 3 feet away. Not too close, deliberate distance, and he took off his hat. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Mr. Holloway." His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried, the voice of someone who had spent a great deal of time in quiet places and had lost the habit of filling silence. "You made it," he said, which was such an obvious statement that for a moment she almost laughed, And then she understood that he wasn't being obtuse, he was being relieved. "We made it," she agreed. He looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with 16 years of practiced skepticism all over his face, and he didn't bother to hide it. Grant Holloway did not seem offended. He just nodded, slowly, as if the boy's distrust was reasonable, and he was acknowledging it rather than trying to dissolve it. "How was the ride?" he asked, not to Evelyn but to Caleb, who was still holding his mother's hand. Caleb thought about it. "Long," he said. "The seats are hard." "They are," Grant said. "I know." He picked up 2 of the carpet bags, the heaviest 2 without asking which they were, and carried them to the wagon. And that was it. No speech, no reassurances, no attempt to charm anyone. Evelyn watched him and thought, well, he is exactly what he said he was. She didn't know yet whether that was a good thing. She didn't know yet what was already moving against them. The conversations already happening in the back room of the saloon, the papers already signed, the man already watching from the window of the land office who would remember this moment later and describe it to Victor Blackridge in careful detail. None of them knew, climbing into that wagon, that they had already been noticed, that the fact of their arrival, a widow and 4 sons at Holloway Ranch, had already been registered and cataloged by someone who intended to make certain it was temporary. The wagon wheels turned in the dirt, and Crestfall fell behind them, and ahead was the long, flat reach of the Wyoming frontier, and somewhere out in that cold expanse was a ranch that needed people and a family that needed a ranch, and the distance between what they needed and what they were about to face was not empty at all. It was full of things none of them could see yet. The drive to the ranch was an hour and a half, and Grant Holloway said perhaps 30 words the entire way. Evelyn found she didn't mind. She had lived with a man who talked all the time. Daniel had narrated the world as he moved through it, a running commentary on everything. And she had loved that about him and then missed it enormously. And then, in the past 11 months, she had quietly discovered that silence was actually something she needed to relearn to tolerate. She was tolerating it now. Silas sat in the back with his brothers, and she could feel him watching the back of Grant Holloway's head the entire drive. The ranch appeared when they crested a low rise, and Evelyn got her first look at what she had agreed to. The main house was solid. That was the first thing she registered, that it was structurally sound, built to last. Not charming, but not falling apart either. The barn was large, larger than the house. There were outbuildings she couldn't immediately identify. The fences she could see needed mending. The yard was honest about its own neglect. A year's worth of small tasks not done, nothing catastrophic, but the accumulation of a man alone who had spent his energy on the animals and let the cosmetics go. "It's bigger than I expected," she said, because something had to be said. "House has 4 rooms," Grant said. 2 upstairs, 2 down. I thought the boys might want the upstairs." "That'll do," Evelyn said. They pulled up to the house and Grant came around to help with the bags, and the boys climbed down, and for a moment all of them were just standing there in the Wyoming afternoon, the wind coming in cold from the north, looking at this place that was supposed to become something. Eli said, "Are those cattle? Over there?" "Those are cattle," Grant said. "How many?" 312 at last count. Eli's eyes went wide in a way that only an 11-year-old's can, as if 312 of anything was a number so large it bordered on the miraculous. Caleb said, "Do you have a dog?" A pause. Something shifted in Grant Holloway's face, so brief Evelyn almost missed it, a shadow that crossed and disappeared. "Had one," he said. "Last winter." Caleb understood immediately, the way children sometimes understand things before the words fully organize. "Oh," he said softly. "I'm sorry." Grant looked at the boy for a moment, just looked at him. Then he said, "Thank you," and he said it like he meant it. Silas watched all of this from 4 steps back, his arms crossed, his face doing the complicated work of a young man who wants to disapprove of something and can't quite find the angle. Later, after the bags were inside, after Evelyn had walked through every room with the methodical eye of someone making plans, after the boys had been fed the plain, adequate meal Grant had clearly put genuine effort into despite his limited culinary range, Silas caught his mother alone in the kitchen while the others were upstairs. "He's hiding something," Silas said. Evelyn didn't look up from the counter she was wiping down, because it needed wiping down and because it gave her a moment to choose her words. "Every person hides something," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the truest one I've got." She turned to face him. "Silas, he made room for us. He hasn't said a single wrong thing. He spoke to Caleb like he mattered. People can be polite because they want something." "Yes," she said, "they can. And your father was kind to me every day we were married because it was simply who he was, and both things can be true in the world." She folded the cloth. "Give it time. That's all I'm asking." Silas's jaw worked. "If he gives me reason," he said finally, "any reason, then you come to me first. Not to him. To me." A long pause. Outside, the wind had picked up and was making the kind of noise against the walls that was going to take some getting used to. "Fine," Silas said. He went upstairs. Evelyn stood in the kitchen of Holloway Ranch in the dark, listening to the wind and the settling sounds of an old house accommodating new weight, and she thought, one day at a time. That's how you do something impossible. You just do the next day. She didn't hear the horse that had been watching from the tree line to the north, the one that turned and rode away as the last light went out in the kitchen window. She didn't yet know his name. She would. The first morning at Holloway Ranch came without ceremony. Evelyn was up before the sun, which was a habit so old it had stopped feeling like a choice. The kitchen was cold, the stove needed feeding, and the coffee Grant kept was the cheap kind that needed twice as long to brew before it tasted like anything. She found all of this out in the first 20 minutes of being awake, and she made a mental note of each one. Not complaints, just information. The inventory of a new life. Grant was already outside. She could hear him moving in the barn before the sky had turned from black to gray, the low sound of cattle, a door swinging. She thought about Daniel again. He had hated mornings, always had, would lie in bed until she physically removed the blanket, laughing the whole time, calling her a tyrant. She pushed the memory down to somewhere manageable and focused on the coffee. Silas came downstairs while she was standing at the window watching the barn. He didn't say anything, just poured himself a cup of the thin coffee, stood beside her, and watched the same barn. "He's been out there since before I came down," Evelyn said. Silas made a non-committal sound. "That's what the man said he was," she said. "A worker." She let it go. Owen appeared next, notebook already in hand. She had never in 13 years of his life seen him come downstairs without something to write in, which she had stopped finding remarkable and started finding comforting, the way any reliable thing becomes comforting. He went straight to the table, opened the notebook, and wrote something before he even sat down. "What are you writing?" Silas asked, because even he was not immune to curiosity about Owen's notebooks. "Observations about the property from last night," Owen said. "The east fence line we passed on the way in has at least 40 feet of damaged wire. There's water staining on the north wall of the barn that suggests a leak in the roof. The soil on the west side of the—" "Owen," Evelyn said. "Yes?" "Eat first." He ate first. The twins came down last, Eli pulling Caleb by the back of his shirt, both of them already in an argument about something that had apparently started in their sleep. The argument died when they hit the kitchen, the way all arguments died in the presence of food and their mother simultaneously. Caleb ate with both hands. Eli ate while looking out the window toward where Grant had disappeared into the barn. "Can we help?" Eli asked. He was 11, and therefore help was a concept he applied broadly and somewhat optimistically. "After breakfast," Evelyn said, "and only if Mr. Holloway says it's all right." "He seems like the kind of man who'd say it's all right," Eli said. "You met him for 4 hours yesterday," Silas said. "Long enough to know he's not going to say no to free labor." Silas looked like he wanted to argue with this and couldn't find the specific flaw in the logic. Grant came in from the barn when the sky had gone fully gray, and the air outside had the particular cold that preceded dawn. He stopped at the door, knocked his boots clean on the scraper, and came into the kitchen in the way of a man who had spent years moving carefully through spaces he lived in alone, deliberate, quiet, already apologizing for his presence with his body language before anyone had objected. He looked at the table, at all 5 of them sitting there with their varying coffee cups and breakfast plates, and the particular chaos of 4 boys occupying a space. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Evelyn said. "Sit down. There's eggs." He sat down. She put eggs in front of him, and he ate without preamble, without thanking her excessively, without the awkward performance of a man trying to prove he was grateful. He just ate. She found she respected that more than a speech would have been. Eli said, "Can we help in the barn today?" Grant glanced at Evelyn, which was the right move, and she gave a small nod. "After we've eaten," he said. "I'll put you on fence line check with me this morning if your mother agrees." "She agrees," Eli said immediately. "I agree," Evelyn confirmed. Silas said nothing, but she saw him watching Grant's face when he said fence line check, the way Silas always watched for the evidence behind the action. The evidence was this. Grant spent that first full day working alongside all four boys with a patience that was not performed. It wasn't the exaggerated patience of a man trying to make a good impression. It was the quiet patience of someone who had once been young and remembered what it felt like to not know things. He showed Eli how to check a wire for weak points by running his hand along it rather than pulling at it. He answered Owen's questions, and Owen had many, rapid and precise, with complete information rather than the abbreviated answers adults usually gave children they didn't expect to understand. When Caleb got his boot stuck in a mud patch and fell backward, Grant was the one who pulled him out before Silas could move, and he did it without laughing, which Caleb seemed to appreciate enormously. Silas watched all of this from close proximity and found nothing to condemn and was visibly irritated by that fact. By the end of the first week, a shape had begun to emerge from the chaos of arrival. Evelyn had rearranged the kitchen in a way that made it functional rather than merely occupied. She had found the source of the damp smell in the back hallway, a gap in the window caulking, simple, fixable, and fixed it herself before mentioning it to Grant, not to show off, but because waiting felt wasteful. She had started a list of what the household needed, organized by urgency, and another list of what the ranch needed, organized by her best assessment of what would cost money versus what would cost only labor. Owen had mapped the entire property in his notebook. Not beautifully, his drawing was utilitarian, all straight lines and measurements he'd paced out himself, but comprehensively. He showed it to Grant on the fourth evening, sliding it across the kitchen table without preamble, and Grant studied it for a long time without speaking. "This is accurate," Grant said finally. "I know," Owen said. "The damaged section of east fence is longer than I thought. It's closer to 60 feet. Grant looked at him over the notebook. "How'd you measure it?" "I walked it twice and counted my steps. My stride is approximately 2 feet, 2 inches. Another pause. "You measured your own stride." "Last spring. I thought it was useful to know." Grant looked at the notebook again, then at Owen. "Have you eaten yet?" "No." "Then eat first. We can go over this after." They went over it after. Evelyn watched them from across the room, the man who rarely spoke and the boy who spoke precisely, and thought that she had not predicted this particular thing. She had not predicted which of her sons would find a way in first, and she had been wrong about it being Eli, who was the easiest, or Caleb, who everyone liked. It was Owen, with his notebook and his measurements and his complete indifference to whether Grant found him strange. Things that needed to be fixed got fixed. Things that needed to be built got started. The rhythm of the ranch was not graceful. It was effortful, noisy, frequently interrupted by equipment that didn't cooperate and weather that didn't care about anyone's plans. Evelyn discovered she was stronger than she'd been before Missouri, which surprised her. Grief had apparently built something in her without her noticing. What she didn't notice, what none of them noticed in those first busy weeks, was that they were being watched. The first sign came on a Thursday, 22 days after their arrival. Evelyn was in the yard when she heard the horse. She looked up and saw a rider she didn't recognize sitting on a big gray gelding at the edge of the property line, just watching. Not doing anything, not approaching, just watching the way a man watches something he's calculating. When she looked at him long enough that acknowledgement was unavoidable, he turned and rode north without a word. She mentioned it to Grant that evening. Grant's expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It went flat and still in a way that was different from his usual quiet. It was the expression of a man who recognizes something he had hoped not to have to deal with yet. "What did he look like?" Grant asked. Tall in the saddle, dark coat, riding a gray horse. She paused. He had the look of a man who gets paid to notice things. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's likely one of Blackridge's men." She'd heard the name. In Crestfall, it came up the way certain names always came up in small towns. Sideways, attached to other things, the way people reference someone powerful without quite saying they're powerful. "Victor Blackridge," she said. "You've heard of him." Enough to understand the tone people use when they say it. Grant turned his coffee cup on the table. Once? Twice? He's been trying to buy this land for 4 years. Before Martha died, during, after. He sends an offer every 6 months regular as seasons. He stopped turning the cup. "I've said no every time." "And now?" "And now I have a family on this land," Grant said. Not boastfully, almost matter-of-factly, like he was stating a new condition in an ongoing negotiation, which I suspect changes his calculation. Evelyn thought about the rider watching from the property line. The patience of it, the deliberateness. "What kind of man is he?" she asked. Grant considered the question carefully. "The kind that doesn't get angry, gets organized." He looked at her. "That's more dangerous." She stored this information. She was very good at storing information. She did not sleep well that night, which she had not done often enough to be good at accepting. What happened next did not come as violence or threat. It came as a social call, which was worse, in Evelyn's experience, because you couldn't prepare for a social call the same way. The woman who came to call was named Margaret Hale, the wife of the nearest neighboring rancher, and she arrived one afternoon with a covered dish and the particular smile of someone delivering both food and judgment simultaneously. She was pleasant, she was gracious. She complimented the house and asked about the boys and said all the right things in the right order, and then just as she was preparing to leave, she said, "You're brave coming out here like this." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "No, I mean..." Margaret seemed to hesitate, though Evelyn suspected the hesitation was practiced. "It's just that people are talking. You know how it is. A widow, alone, and Holloway of all men, he's not exactly known for being social, and with Blackridge already having his eye on this land..." She stopped. "I just want you to understand what you've walked into, dear. That's all." After Margaret left, Evelyn stood on the porch and looked out at the property, at Owen crossing the yard with his notebook, and Caleb chasing one of the barn cats, and Silas up on the roof of the small outbuilding helping Grant repair the shingles. She stood there and let Margaret's words settle into her. What you've walked into. She thought about 13 unanswered letters. She thought about the boarding house, and the cracked knuckles, and the bank officer who wouldn't meet her eyes. She thought, I know exactly what I walked into. The question is whether it walks into me. The fence sabotage began the following week. It started small enough that it could have been an accident. A section of wire on the northeast corner that had been properly checked 2 days prior was down on Monday morning. 3 posts pulled out of the ground with the kind of force that didn't come from weather. Grant found it before breakfast and fixed it without telling Evelyn immediately, which she discovered at noon and was mildly annoyed about. I would have liked to know, she said. Thought it might have been an accident, Grant said. Did you think it was an accident? A pause. No. Then I would have liked to know. He looked at her with the expression of a man adjusting his understanding of someone. All right, he said. I'll tell you. He told her when it happened again the following Thursday. A longer section this time, 30 feet of wire, not just pulled but cut cleanly with something sharp. 2 of the posts had been knocked over with deliberate force. 3 cattle had wandered through the gap into scrubland before Grant caught them. Silas found out about this one because he was with Grant when they found it. He came back to the house with Grant, and his face had the particular quality of someone who has been expecting bad news and is now dealing with the fact that they were right to expect it, which is different from satisfaction and closer to dread. This isn't random, Silas said to his mother, pulling her aside in the kitchen. No, she agreed. Grant thinks it's Blackridge. Grant is right. Then we should Silas started. We should document it, Evelyn said. He blinked. Document it. Every incident, date, time, location, what was damaged, how it was damaged, what it cost us. She was already thinking about Owen's notebook, about the maps. about what organized information could become with enough time and precision. If this goes where I think it's going, evidence will matter more than reaction. Silas stared at her. He's cutting our fences, Mama. I know. I know what you want to do, and if you do it, you give him exactly what he needs to make us the problem. She kept her voice level because he needed her to be level right now, even though her hands were not entirely steady under the counter where he couldn't see them. We do not give Victor Blackridge a reason to point at us. We make him point at himself. Do you understand the difference? A long silence. The kind where a 16-year-old boy is fighting his own instincts. Yes, he said finally. Not happily, but yes. Owen began keeping a second notebook. This one was dedicated entirely to incidents, dates and locations, and his own careful diagrams showing the pattern of damage, which, by the third week, was no longer deniable as coincidence. The sabotage followed a rotation. It moved around the perimeter of the property deliberately, never hitting the same section twice in a row, designed to maximize cost and disruption while maintaining the plausibility of accident. It's systematic, Owen told Grant and Evelyn on a Tuesday evening. He spread his notebook open on the kitchen table. Look, if you draw a line through the three incidents, they describe the perimeter in a counterclockwise pattern, which means, he pointed with his pen, the next most likely target is the southwest section. Here. Grant studied the notebook the way he had studied the property map, thoroughly, silently. Then he looked at Owen. How old are you? Grant asked. 13, Owen said, in the tone of someone who has been asked this as a form of dismissal before. I'm asking because I want to put you on the southwest check tomorrow, Grant said. Not to do anything if you see something, just to tell me if something happens. Owen sat up slightly straighter. I can do that. I know you can, Grant said. That's why I'm asking. Evelyn watched this exchange and said nothing. She was storing it the way she stored most things now. The livestock problem began with 2 calves. They were found dead in the south pasture on a Wednesday morning, no obvious injury, no signs of predator activity. The ground was dry and the grass around them was undisturbed. Grant crouched over them for a long time without speaking. Evelyn came out to look. Poison? She said. Something in the water. He pointed to the small trough in the south pasture, slightly apart from the main water supply. That trough isn't connected to the main line. It fills from surface runoff. Someone got to the runoff source? Uphill from here, Grant said. Half a mile, maybe less. He stood up, and his face was doing that flat, still thing again. I missed it. Should have thought to check. You have 300 acres to watch. It's my land. I should have thought to check. She didn't argue because it wasn't the time for it, and because she understood the particular self-recrimination of someone who feels responsible for things that were done to them. She had felt it for months after Daniel died, the irrational accounting of every decision she might have made differently. What she did instead was go to the trough herself with a glass jar. She took a water sample. She put it in the jar, sealed it with wax from the kitchen, and labeled it with Owen's pen in her own handwriting. South Pasture Trough, October 14th, 2 calves deceased. She put it on the shelf in the kitchen beside Owen's notebooks. Silas saw her do it. He didn't say anything, but the look he gave her was one she recognized. The look of someone who has decided, reluctantly and without announcement, to do it someone else's way. The confrontation in town was inevitable, and it came the way inevitable things always do, sooner than expected and in the wrong setting. Evelyn had gone to Crestfall for supplies with Owen and Caleb, leaving Grant and Silas and Eli to work the south fence line. It was a Thursday, which was the day the general store restocked, and she needed flour and thread and a new blade for the kitchen knife that had given up its edge. She had a list, which she always had. Lists kept the world from feeling entirely improvised. She was in the general store when he walked in. She knew him before anyone said his name, because he had the quality she had learned to recognize in certain kinds of powerful men. The quality of someone who has not been told no in so long that their body has forgotten how to accommodate the possibility. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for Crestfall, with the kind of face that would have been handsome 20 years ago, and had settled into something more architectural. He had 2 men with him. He didn't need 2 men with him for a general store. He had them because having them was a statement. Victor Blackridge. He saw her immediately. She had the feeling he had known she would be here. He walked to where she stood at the counter and stopped. And he looked at her with the expression of someone who is going to be very polite while doing something unkind. "Mrs. Cross," he said. She went still inside in a way she'd learned from the past 11 months. "Mr. Blackridge." The store had gone quiet. The clerk had stopped moving. Owen, to Evelyn's left, had clicked the cap on his pen and gone very still, in the particular way he went still when he was paying close attention to something. "I wanted to introduce myself," Blackridge said. "I've been meaning to come by the ranch, but—" He paused, and the pause was calculated. "I didn't want to intrude on what I understand is a complicated situation." "It's not complicated," Evelyn said. "It's a working ranch." He glanced around the store. A performance, not a real survey. "I've heard Grant Holloway has been having some trouble lately. Fence line problems. Livestock." He said these things the way you'd say weather or road conditions. Neutral. Helpful, almost. "Nothing we can't manage," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment, looked at Owen, then back at her. "You're a long way from Missouri, Mrs. Cross," he said, pleasantly. These kinds of arrangements, another pause, another calculation, they don't always work out the way people hope. Wyoming winters are hard. Running a ranch is hard, especially for a woman raising 4 boys on her own. "I'm not on my own," she said. "Of course not." The smile didn't change. "I just want you to know that if things become untenable, I'm a man of resources. I'm happy to help facilitate a transition to something more manageable for everyone involved." Evelyn looked at him for a moment, at the careful construction of his face, at the 2 men standing behind him who were just large enough to make a point without making a threat. She picked up her list from the counter. She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "Owen, let's finish up." She turned back to the clerk and continued her shopping. Behind her, she could feel Blackridge standing there for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she heard his footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, moving toward the door. Owen pressed close to her as she counted out flour. His voice was very quiet. "He knows your name." "Yes." "He knew about the fence and the livestock." "Yes." "He knew you were from Missouri." She put the flour in her basket. "He's been paying attention to us for a while, I think." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not as smart as he thinks he is." She looked at her 13-year-old son. "What makes you say that?" "He told us things without meaning to," Owen said. "He knows about the fence damage and the livestock, but our neighbors don't know about the livestock. We haven't told anyone. So either he has someone watching the property directly, or—" Owen's pen clicked again, a habit, a thinking noise. "The person who's doing it is telling him." Evelyn stood in the general store in Crestfall, Wyoming, with her flour and her list, and her 13-year-old son's deduction hanging in the cold air between them, and she thought, he's not wrong. She bought the thread and the knife blade and drove home with Owen and Caleb, and that evening she told Grant and Silas what had happened. Grant listened to all of it without expression. When she was done, he said, "He's never come at me directly before." "He came at me," Evelyn said, "not you, which means he thinks you're the softer approach." "He's wrong." Grant looked at her. For the first time since their arrival, the look held something different. Not assessment, not careful observation, but something closer to recognition. Like seeing something in another person that you know the shape of because you have the same thing somewhere in yourself. "I know," he said. "I know he is." Silas said, "We need to tell the sheriff." "Elias Pruitt has been in Crestfall for 12 years, Grant said. "He'll take a report, he'll look concerned, and then he'll remember that Blackridge employs a third of this county, and he'll file the paper at the bottom of a stack." He wasn't bitter when he said it, just factual. "That's not an accusation, that's just the truth of how it works out here." "Then we do it Owen's way," Silas said, surprising everyone, including himself. Owen looked up from his notebook. "What do you mean, Owen's way?" Silas's jaw was tight. The documentation, the evidence, He gestured vaguely at the notebooks. All of it. We build a case that even a bought sheriff can't ignore. Evelyn looked at her oldest son, at the particular cost on his face of having chosen patience over instinct. She understood what that choice had taken from him, and she did not make it smaller by praising it too much. That's exactly what we're going to do, she said. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest in Evelyn's memory, not because any single thing happened that was unbearable, but because of the steady, grinding nature of the siege. It was not a dramatic attack. It was erosion, the kind of pressure that doesn't break you at once but makes you question every morning whether today is the day you finally run out of something. A second water source was contaminated. Owen caught it early because he had implemented his own checking system, going out each morning to test each separate water supply with a piece of fabric he'd read about in a stock management pamphlet Grant had in the barn. He came in on a Tuesday morning, fabric in hand, face composed, and said, "North Trough. Don't let the cattle use it." Grant stood at the kitchen table and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." That was all. "All right." And he went to fix it. Evelyn watched him go and thought about what it cost a man to say all right to the steady destruction of something he'd spent years building. She thought it cost him a very great deal, and she thought the fact that he kept saying it, quietly, without theater, was its own kind of remarkable. Eli had started following Grant around the ranch in the way he did things, which was without strategy and entirely from instinct. He would simply appear near whatever Grant was doing, mending a post, checking cattle, working the small repairs on the barn roof that never seemed to end, and make himself useful in the uncomplicated way of an 11-year-old who had decided he liked someone and was not interested in the complications. Grant didn't send him away. He put him to work. One evening, Evelyn overheard them from the barn doorway. She had come to tell Eli dinner was ready and had stopped before she reached them because something in the quality of the conversation made her slow her feet. Eli was asking about Martha, Grant's wife. The question was so direct and so unguarded that only a child could have asked it that way. What was she like? A silence. Then Grant said, "She was good at seeing the useful thing about people. Most people are hard to know. She made it easy." "My dad was like that," Eli said. "Yeah?" "Yeah, he could talk to anybody. Mama says it was his best thing." Another silence. "What was his second best thing?" Eli thought about it with apparent seriousness. "He made really good biscuits, way better than Mama, but don't tell her I said that." Evelyn, in the doorway, pressed her lips together. "I won't tell her," Grant said, and she heard in his voice, carefully, because she was listening, something that had not been there in those first weeks, something that lived very close to warmth. She stepped back from the barn door and gave them another minute, and then called Eli's name loudly enough that they'd know she was coming. The legal papers arrived on a Friday morning. A man on horseback delivered them, not a casual rider, a county official with a badge and a sealed envelope. Grant took the envelope. He opened it at the kitchen table with Evelyn beside him and read through it with the unhurried attention of a man making himself be slower than his instincts. It was a property dispute claim. Victor Blackridge, through his attorney, was asserting a prior claim on the eastern quarter of Holloway Ranch land, based on, and here was the language that made Evelyn's eyes sharpen, a deed of conditional transfer from 1871 that allegedly superseded the current title. "That's 14 years ago," she said. "I was 27 in 1871, Grant said. "I bought this land in 1873. That deed, if it exists, predates my ownership." "Does it exist?" Grant was quiet. "I don't know. I never heard of it before." "He manufactured it," Silas said from the doorway. He had the flat certainty of a young man who has been right about something too many times lately. "Maybe," Evelyn said. "Or he found something real and is using it in a way it was never meant to be used. Either way," she folded her hands on the table, "we need someone who knows land law." "Nearest proper lawyer is in Laramie," Grant said. "Then write to Laramie," Evelyn said. "Tonight." Grant looked at the papers again, then at Evelyn. There was something in that look she wasn't sure she had words for yet, a quality of being seen that she both wanted and found destabilizing. The way any real thing is destabilizing when you've been bracing so long. "You're not what I expected," he said. It was not a compliment. It was something more specific than that. "I know," she said. "Write the letter, Grant." He wrote the letter. Owen spent the following 4 days rebuilding his documentation into something that could accompany a legal filing. He cross-referenced every incident with dates, organized the water samples Evelyn had been collecting, drew clear maps of each damaged location with measurements. He worked at the kitchen table in the evenings until the oil lamp burned low and no one told him to stop. On the 4th night, Silas sat down across from him. They worked in silence for a while, Silas going through the older notes while Owen wrote new ones. "Your handwriting is better than mine," Owen said without looking up. "I'm aware," Silas said. "You could write the summaries, the header sections. They need to be clear." A pause. "You're asking me to help." "You're already sitting here," Owen pointed out. Silas picked up a pen. He wrote the first summary section in his even, careful hand, and Owen read it when it was done and said, "That's good," which from Owen was as close to effusive as he ever got. They worked together until midnight. Evelyn came downstairs for water and found them both at the table, the lamp low, papers spread between them, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and did not say anything because there were moments that didn't need words, and she had learned in the past year to recognize them. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the dark in the way it always did, without asking permission, without care for anything in its path. Inside, her boys were building something. She went back to bed. The lawyer from Laramie wrote back in 10 days. His name was Arthur Kane, and his letter was precise in the way of someone who had learned that precision was a form of protection. He confirmed that the 1871 deed Blackridge's attorney had cited was a matter of public record. It existed, it had been filed, and it was technically valid under territorial land law as written at the time. What it was not, he wrote, was what Blackridge's attorney was claiming it to be. A conditional transfer was not a title claim. It required fulfillment of specific terms within a defined period, and if those terms had not been met, and Kane had reason to believe they had not, the deed was legally inert. Dead paper. He would need to come to Crestfall to review the original filing, he wrote, and he would need Grant's full chain of title documentation, and he would need time. Time was the one thing they had the least of. Grant read the letter twice at the kitchen table and passed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it once and set it down. "He's confident," she said. "He's careful," Grant said. "There's a difference. Both are useful." She folded the letter back along its crease. "When can he come?" "He says 2 weeks, maybe 3. Silas, who had read it over his mother's shoulder, said, "We don't have 2 weeks. Blackridge filed in the county court. There'll be a hearing before Kane can even get here." "I know," Grant said. "So what do we do until then?" Grant was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind had a different quality than it had even a week ago, lower, slower, with something heavy in it. Grant had been watching that sky for 2 days with the particular attention of a man who had spent 20 years learning to read it. "We do the work," Grant said, "and we get ready for winter." It was not the answer Silas wanted, but it was the true one, and he knew it, which was worse. The sky Grant had been watching made good on its warning 4 days later. The first snow of the season came in the night, not a threat, just a reminder, 2 inches on the ground by morning that turned the ranch from one thing into another. Eli was the first one to the window, already dressed before anyone else was moving, face pressed against the glass with the helpless enthusiasm of a boy who has never entirely lost the ability to be surprised by weather. "It snowed," he announced to everyone who already knew. "I see that," Owen said from his bed, not looking up from whatever he was reading. It really snowed. "Eli, we're in Wyoming in November." But even Owen came to the window eventually, and Evelyn stood behind them both and looked out at the white ranch, and thought about what snow meant for cattle, for fencing, for water troughs, for the dozen things that had been running marginally and would now run worse. She also thought, briefly, before she put it away, that it was beautiful. The way things you're afraid of can also be beautiful from the right distance. Grant was already in the barn. The routine shifted. It always did when winter came to ranching country. The day reorganized itself around different priorities. Feeding schedules changed. The cattle required more attention and more labor. Grant moved through all of it with the competence of someone who had done it alone for 3 years and was still adjusting to having help, sometimes forgetting to delegate and simply doing things himself, sometimes giving instructions in the abbreviated code of a man who'd forgotten that not everyone already knew the shorthand. Silas caught on to the shorthand fastest. That surprised everyone, including Silas. He had spent the first weeks of the ranch on careful guard, watching for the wrong thing, and the watching had made him observant in ways he hadn't entirely intended. He knew the feeding schedule. He knew which cattle were the ones Grant watched most carefully. He knew that the south gate had a hitch in its latch that you had to lift while you pulled, not after. He still didn't trust easily, but he had started trusting the work, which was its own kind of progress. On a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into the first snow, Evelyn walked into the barn and found Grant trying to manage a sick calf alone, which was not working. The calf was weak on its legs, not standing properly, and Grant had his hands full and his face set with the tight expression of a man fighting a losing argument with the situation. "What do you need?" she asked from the doorway. "Another pair of hands and about 6 years of veterinary training," he said. She came in and held the calf steady while he worked. They were close in the way you are when a task requires it, not comfortable, just necessary. She could see the gray in his hair more clearly in the barn light. She could see the way his hands worked, sure and economical, without wasted motion. "You've done this before," she said. "Plenty of times." He kept working. "Martha used to do this. Hold them while I—" He stopped. Started again. "She was better at it than I am. She sounds like she was good at a lot of things." She was. He didn't say it sadly, exactly. He said it the way you say something that is true and that you have made peace with, and that still costs you something each time you say it out loud. Evelyn held the calf. Grant worked. The barn around them was warm in the way only animal warmth makes a cold space warm. Not comfortable, but alive. "Do you think she'd have liked us?" Evelyn asked. She wasn't sure where the question came from. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Grant's hand slowed. He looked at her, not sharply, just looking. "She'd have liked the boys," he said finally. "She always wanted—" He didn't finish that sentence. "Yes, I think she'd have liked you." "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one," he said, and went back to work. The calf survived. Evelyn mentioned this to no one in particular, and everyone noted it anyway. The hearing in county court came on a Thursday that was 17 degrees and full of a wind that found every gap in every coat. Grant and Evelyn drove to Crestfall together, leaving Silas in charge of the ranch, which was its own milestone the first time Grant had left Silas with full responsibility, and the way he'd done it was without ceremony or instruction, just, "You know what needs doing." Silas had nodded. That had been enough. The courthouse was a square building that smelled of wood smoke and cold paper. Blackridge was already there when they arrived, with 2 attorneys and the particular ease of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. He nodded at Grant when they entered. He did not acknowledge Evelyn. She noticed. She noted it in the particular accounting she kept of things people did that they didn't think anyone was tracking. The hearing was preliminary. The judge, a tired-looking man named Hargrove, who seemed to have been sitting on that bench for decades and had run out of things to find surprising, reviewed Blackridge's claim and Grant's counter-documentation and said he would rule on jurisdiction within 2 weeks. He did not seem impressed by either side. He did, however, look twice at Owen's documentation, which Evelyn had brought, organized and labeled and cross-referenced, and asked who had prepared it. "My son," Evelyn said. Judge Hargrove looked at her, then at the documents. "How old is your son?" 13. A pause. "He should consider law," the judge said, which was the closest thing to a ruling in their favor they got that day. Blackridge's attorney spoke for 20 minutes and said very little. Blackridge himself said nothing, which was what made Evelyn's attention sharpen. A man who has nothing to worry about does not sit that still. He was performing calm the way you perform it, when underneath there is something different. Outside, afterward, in the cold that hit like a door closing, Grant said, "Hargrove is fair, if he's allowed to be fair. You think he won't be allowed? Blackridge has a long arm." "So do we," Evelyn said. "Longer than he knows." Grant looked at her sideways. The cold had put color in her face, and she was looking at the courthouse door in the way she looked at problems, directly, without flinching from what was there. "You have something planned," he said. Not a question. "I have something started," she said. "Owen does. It's not ready yet, but it will be." He waited. When she didn't add more, he said, "Are you going to tell me?" "When it's ready to tell," she said. "I'm not going to put hope in your pocket before I know it's real." He thought about this for a moment, and she expected him to push. Most men pushed, wanted to be included, wanted the information even when it wasn't complete. Grant said, "All right," and went to untie the horses. She watched him and thought, he is a genuinely unusual man. She was not sure yet what to do with that fact. What Owen had been building for the past 3 weeks was not, strictly speaking, what anyone had asked him to build. What Evelyn had asked for was a clean record of damages and incidents. What Owen had built was a pattern, not just of what had happened to Holloway Ranch, but of what had happened across the county over the past 6 years. He had done this by reading. He had spent every trip to Crestfall visiting the office of the Crestfall Courier, where the editor, a small, ink-stained woman named Ruth Hadley, who appreciated thoroughness for its own sake, had allowed him access to the paper's archive in exchange for helping her organize it, which Owen had done in 4 hours on a Saturday. 6 years of news, 6 years of ranch disputes, property claims, water rights arguments, foreclosures. Owen had read all of it. What he had found was a fingerprint, not a literal one, but a pattern as distinctive as a fingerprint once you knew what you were looking at. 5 other ranches in the county had faced similar pressure over the past 6 years. Fence damage, livestock problems, legal claims emerging from old paperwork. 3 of those ranches had eventually sold to a landholding company called the Clearwater Property Trust. Owen had looked up the Clearwater Property Trust. The registration papers, which were available at the county clerk's office if you knew to ask for them, listed its principal officer as one James Aldrin, whose name Owen did not recognize. He had asked Ruth Hadley if she knew the name. Ruth Hadley had gone very quiet. Then she had said, "Where did you find that name?" "Property trust registration," Owen said. "James Aldrin," Ruth said slowly, "is Victor Blackridge's brother-in-law." Owen had opened his notebook and written this down with the careful deliberateness of someone placing a stone in exactly the right location. He told his mother that evening. He told her the way he told most things, sitting down, notebook open, beginning with the facts and building to the conclusion without editorializing, letting the shape of the information make its own argument. Evelyn listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she sat for a long time. "You're saying he's been doing this for 6 years," she said. "At minimum," Owen said. "There may be earlier instances I couldn't find in the archive." 5 other ranches, 3 of which sold to his holding company at significantly below market value. The other 2, Owen turned a page. The Berryman family left the county entirely in 1882. I couldn't find any record of what happened to their property, and the Harker Ranch was destroyed in a fire in 1880 that the paper called accidental. The word accidental sat in the room. "Owen," Evelyn said carefully, "I need you to understand what this is." "It's a fraud scheme," he said, "a systematic one. He creates enough pressure through sabotage and legal harassment to force a sale, and then his holding company acquires the property at distressed prices, and the sale goes into a corporate name so Blackridge's name doesn't appear on the deed." "Yes," she said, "and the people who could testify to what happened to their ranches are gone," Owen said. He said it flatly, without dramatization, which was somehow worse. Or afraid. Evelyn looked at her son, this 13-year-old boy with his ink-stained fingers and his organized mind and his complete inability to understand why knowing a thing wouldn't automatically fix it. and she felt something she did not have an easy name for. Not pride, exactly. Something older than pride and more complicated. "This goes beyond us," she said. "I know. If we take this to the county court, to Hargrove, to anyone here, Blackridge knows this county. He has people here." "I know," Owen said again. "That's why I wrote to the territorial government." She stared at him. "I wrote to the office of the Wyoming territorial governor," Owen said, in the tone of someone reporting that they had filed routine paperwork. "3 weeks ago. I sent copies of the incident records and the property trust registration and a summary of the pattern of acquisitions. I addressed it to the office of the territorial attorney general." He paused. "I wasn't sure if that was overstepping." Evelyn looked at her 13-year-old son for a long moment. "That was not overstepping," she said very quietly. "I wasn't sure if you'd be angry." "I am not angry." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and looked back at his notebook. She stood up and walked to the window and stood there, looking out at the dark ranch, at the snow that had come back in the last 2 days and was now steady. Not alarming yet, just insistent, the way Wyoming weather was insistent. She stood there until she was sure her face had done what it needed to do privately, and then she turned back around. "Has there been a response?" she asked. "Not yet, but I sent it 6 weeks ago. The mail from Cheyenne takes—" "I know how long the mail takes, Owen." "Right. Show me the letter you sent." He showed her. She read it. It was precise, organized, devastating in its methodical clarity, and written in the handwriting of a boy who had clearly practiced making his letters look as adult as possible. She handed it back without comment, because there was no comment adequate. The blizzard arrived on a night in late November when the temperature had already been dropping for 3 days in a way that Grant said was not normal dropping, was something different. He had been watching the sky again, that same intent reading of clouds and wind direction, and on the evening before it hit, he told everyone at dinner that they needed to check every water source, move the most vulnerable cattle closer to the barn, and make sure there was firewood inside the house sufficient for 4 days. 4 days? Eli said. "Maybe more," Grant said. "Eat your dinner." They did the checks. They moved the cattle. Silas and Eli and Grant worked until 11 that night getting the herd repositioned, and Evelyn and Owen and Caleb brought wood until the stack beside the door was chest high on Owen, and they ran out of inside space to put more. Then the storm hit. It did not arrive the way storms arrived in Missouri, gradually, with warning, rain first, and then heavier rain, and then the thing itself. It arrived the way Wyoming storms arrived, which was all at once and without apology. By midnight, the wind was audible through every wall of the house. Not the usual complaints of an old building and wind, but something structural, something that made the windows shake in their frames. By 3 in the morning, there was no visibility past 10 feet from the house, and the temperature outside had dropped to something Grant said he hadn't seen in years. They kept the fire going in shifts. No one slept well. Caleb ended up on the floor of the main room wrapped in 2 blankets, which was where Evelyn found him at 4:30 and chose not to move him. Owen fell asleep at the kitchen table over his notebook, pen still in hand, and Silas appeared in the doorway at some point and looked at him and carefully took the pen out of his hand and put a blanket over his shoulders without waking him. Evelyn watched Silas do this from the hallway and thought, "There he is, my boy." At first light, which was a generous description of what arrived in the morning, more a slightly less dark version of the darkness, Grant was already dressed and at the door. "The cattle need checking," he said. "You're not going out alone," Silas said from the table. "I've done it." "Not in this," Silas said. He looked at the door, at what was visible through the window, which was white and moving and nothing else. "Not in this alone." A pause. Grant looked at Silas with the particular expression he'd been developing over the past weeks, the expression that said, "You're probably right, but I'm not used to anyone saying so." "All right," Grant said, "get your coat." They went out together. Evelyn watched them go from the window, the 2 of them immediately swallowed by the white, visible for maybe 5 steps, and then gone. She turned back to the room, to Owen still asleep at the table and Caleb burrowed in his blankets, and she went to the stove and fed it and put water on and made herself be useful while every instinct she had was at the window. They were out for 40 minutes, which was long enough that she was working on what she would do if they didn't come back when she heard the door. Both of them. Silas first, then Grant. Silas had ice in his eyebrows, and his face was the red white of someone who had been seriously cold. Grant had his arm around him, not holding him up exactly, more the way you put an arm around someone who doesn't need it, but you're doing it anyway. 3 cattle in the northeast section, Grant said, moving for the stove. They went through the storm fence. We need to get them back. After you've warmed up, Evelyn said. After, she said, and put a cup in his hand. He drank it. Silas sat at the table and wrapped both hands around his own cup and said nothing. His shoulders gradually came down from their elevated position near his ears. Thank you, Grant said to Silas. Silas looked up. For what? Coming out. A silence in which Silas seemed to be deciding something. You would have gone alone, he said. Yes. That's why I came. He looked back down at his cup. You'd have gotten yourself in trouble, and then we'd have had to come out anyway, and I figured better to just... He stopped, started again. You're not as good at accepting help as you are at giving it. Grant looked at him for a moment. No, he said. I know. Another silence. We need to go back out, Silas said. Give it another half hour, Grant said. Wind's at its worst right now. It'll let up slightly around mid-morning. Then we go. The half hour passed with all of them in the main room, the storm pressing at the walls, the fire doing its work. Caleb woke up and immediately wanted to know if there were animals stuck in the snow, and when told yes, seemed to take this as a personal problem he needed to solve. Owen woke up disoriented, looked at the window, looked at his notebook, and then appeared to have immediately processed the entire situation because he stood up and put his coat on. Owen, Evelyn said. I'm staying inside, he said, which was not what she'd been about to say, but she let it stand. Grant and Silas went back out at 10. Eli, who had been quiet and contained in the way he was only when he'd decided something, appeared at the door with his coat already on. I'm going, he said. Eli, Evelyn started. 3 cattle and 2 people to move them is not enough in that, Eli said. He pointed at the window. He was 11 years old and he was using his reasonable voice, which was unnerving. I've been doing the cattle work for 3 weeks. I know the northeast section. You need someone who knows where the fence posts are, or they'll walk right past them in the white. Evelyn looked at him. He was right. She hated that he was right. You stay within 10 feet of Grant or Silas at all times, she said. If they say come back, you come back immediately. No argument. No argument, he said, and he meant it, which was how she knew this version of Eli was serious. He went out. The 3 of them were gone for 2 hours. Evelyn did not allow herself to stand at the window the entire time, because that helped no one. She fed the stove. She helped Caleb with a spelling exercise he'd been avoiding for 2 days. She listened to Owen at the table behind her, who had taken out the Blackridge documents and was working through them in whatever way his mind worked through things, quiet and steady. At one point he said without looking up, They'll be all right. I know, Evelyn said. Silas won't let anything happen. I know, Owen. I'm just saying. I heard you. She didn't add that she appreciated it, because he would have dismissed the appreciation as unnecessary. She just heard it and let it sit. They came back at noon, all 3 of them, and the cattle were with them, all 3 animals penned into the barn, which had required Eli to make a running tackle on the most stubborn one, which he reported with considerable satisfaction, while Evelyn checked his hands for frostbite and found none. That was when it happened. Grant was in the barn, settling the cattle, and Silas was at the door pulling his boots off when Eli said, Silas went in after one of them, into the low section by the east ravine. The snow was filling it up, and the cow had gone in and... Eli, Silas said. He went in and it was deeper than it looked, Eli continued, in the rapid way of someone who'd been holding on to a story since it happened. He was up to his chest in snow, and the sides were... It kept collapsing, and... Eli, that's enough. Grant went in after him, Eli said. He didn't even stop. He just went in after him. Silas stood at the door in his socks, not looking at anyone, face doing the complicated private work of a person who has just had an experience they haven't processed yet. Evelyn looked at her oldest son, at the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his silence. She went to him. She put her hand on his arm, just once, briefly, not a hug. He had been too old for easy hugs since Daniel died. Just contact. He didn't move away. After a moment, he said quietly, "He didn't wait to think about it." "No," she said. "He just—" A pause. "He just came in." "Yes." Silas swallowed. He picked up his boots and went upstairs, and Evelyn heard his feet on the ceiling above her, the particular sound of someone who needs to be alone for a little while and is allowing themselves to have it. Grant came in from the barn 20 minutes later, blowing cold air and stomping snow off his boots. He went to the stove without looking at anyone, poured coffee, drank half of it standing up. Evelyn handed him a towel for his face. He took it, looked at her. "Eli told me," she said. He shrugged slightly, the particular shrug of someone who has done something that felt involuntary and doesn't know how to receive credit for it. "He was in trouble," Grant said. "I know. I wasn't going to—" He stopped, looked at his coffee. "I wasn't going to just stand there." "I know," she said again. He looked at her for a moment, and his face was doing something she hadn't entirely seen it do before. Not the closed stillness he defaulted to, but something more open, more exposed than he usually allowed, like the cold had taken some of the composure with it when it finally came off. "He's a good kid," Grant said. "Silas, he—" He stopped again. "He kept his head out there. Most men twice his age would have panicked. He's his father's son," Evelyn said. A long beat. "He's something more than that now," Grant said very quietly. She did not look away from him. He did not look away from her. It was Caleb who broke the moment, appearing from the corner of the room with the impeccable timing of an 8-year-old. "Is everyone back? Can we eat now? I've been hungry for hours." "You're always hungry," Owen said from the table. "That's not an answer." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Sit down. Everyone sit down." They sat, all 6 of them, at the table in the kitchen of Holloway Ranch with the storm still going at the walls and the fire doing what fires do, and the meal was plain and sufficient and nobody said anything important. Eli told the story of the cattle again, with embellishments that grew slightly with each retelling. Caleb ate 2 portions of everything. Owen read over his notes between bites, and no one made him stop. Silas came back downstairs and sat at his usual place, and was quiet in a way that was not the same as his earlier quiet. Something had shifted in it. Grant looked at each of them, once, in the way you look at something you are trying to memorize. He didn't say anything. He just ate his dinner. It was 2 days after the blizzard had finally broken, when the sky had gone that particular high cold blue that followed Wyoming storms, that Owen found what he had been looking for without quite knowing he was looking for it. He found it in the land office. He had asked to see the original 1871 conditional transfer deed, the one Blackridge's attorney was using as the basis for the property claim, because he wanted to check the filing date against the county record index he had been quietly building. Ruth Hadley at the Courier had given him access to the record index in exchange for his continued help with the archive, and the county clerk, a tired man named Bertram, who had been in that office so long the furniture had started to resemble him, had let Owen review the deed because Owen had the careful demeanor of someone engaged in legitimate research, and people tended to hand legitimate-seeming people things without quite deciding to. The deed was real. He'd expected that. What he had not expected was what was on the reverse side, not the public-facing side, not the part that had been referenced in Blackridge's legal filing, but the back of the paper, where the filing officer's notes were recorded in pencil. One line, almost illegible. A name and a date. Owen stood at the counter in the Crestfall land office with the 1871 deed in his hands and felt the particular sensation he associated with finding the thing that made everything else make sense. It was not exciting, exactly. It was clarifying. The same feeling as when the numbers in a calculation finally resolved. The name on the back of the deed was T. Aldrin, Thomas Aldrin, Victor Blackridge's father-in-law. The man who had filed the original conditional transfer deed in 1871 had done so under a name connected directly to the Blackridge family, not James Aldrin, the brother-in-law who ran the Clearwater Property Trust, but the generation before him. The same family, the same fingerprint, going back further than anyone had looked. Owen asked Bertram very carefully who had filed the deed in 1871. Bertram looked at the name. His face did something complicated. That was before my time, Bertram said. I understand, Owen said. But is there a record of the filing officer, the person who accepted the deed for registration? Bertram looked at him for a long moment. Owen waited. He was very good at waiting. Bertram went to the back room. He was gone for 15 minutes. When he came back, he had a ledger so old its cover had softened to the texture of cloth. 1871 Registry, he said. He opened it on the counter without touching the specific page for a moment. The hesitation of someone who knows what they're about to show is significant. Then he turned it so Owen could read. The filing officer for the 1871 conditional transfer deed was listed as Harold Pruitt. Owen looked at the name. Then he looked at Bertram. Pruitt, Owen said, as in, Sheriff Elias Pruitt's father, Bertram said. His voice had gone flat and careful. He was deputy recorder in 1871. Owen closed his notebook. He did not write this down in front of Bertram because he was 13 years old and had spent enough time around documents to understand that some things you wrote down later when no one was watching you write. Thank you, he said. He walked out of the land office into the cold, crestfall afternoon, and he stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the bright post-blizzard light, with the knowledge of what he had just found settling into the ordered rooms of his mind. The corruption wasn't recent. It wasn't just Blackridge. It went back a generation, into the county's own records, into the office of the man responsible for enforcing its laws. He turned and walked to the livery where the horse was tied, and he rode back to the ranch with his notebook in his lap and his mind moving through what this meant and what needed to happen next. And by the time he came through the gate, he had a plan that was not complete, but was the right shape. The storm had changed things. He was only beginning to understand how many things it had changed. Owen did not tell anyone what he had found until he had thought about it for a full day. This was how he handled things that were large. He needed to turn them over completely before he spoke about them, the way you needed to look at all sides of something before you could describe its shape accurately. He spent that day going through his notebooks, cross-referencing the Pruitt name against every other document he had cataloged, checking whether it appeared anywhere else. It appeared twice more. Once in the 1878 record of a water rights dispute that had been resolved in Blackridge's favor by a ruling from the county board, a board whose secretary that year had been one Harold Pruitt, now deceased. Once in a small notice in the 1880 Courier Archive, a social item, the kind of brief notice that ran in small-town papers to fill space. Harold Pruitt, retired from county service, attended the Blackridge winter reception at the Larkspur Hotel. A social item. The kind of thing nobody read twice. Owen had read it twice. Owen had read everything twice. He came to Evelyn on a Thursday evening when the others were occupied. Grant and Silas doing the last water check of the day, Eli trying to repair a bridle he'd broken through enthusiastic use, Caleb engaged in something upstairs that sounded educational and also structural. Owen sat down across from his mother at the kitchen table and put his notebook open between them and told her everything in the order he'd found it, which was also the order that made the most logical sense. She listened without interrupting. She had always been good at that, at the specific discipline of letting someone finish before she responded, which was rarer than it should have been, and which Owen had always appreciated without having words for why. When he finished, she looked at the notebook for a long moment. Harold Pruitt is dead, she said, since 1883. Yes. But Elias Pruitt is alive and is the current sheriff. Yes. And you think, I don't know what I think about Elias Pruitt, Owen said with the precision of someone who was being careful not to claim more than the evidence supported. I think his father was involved in the original filing of the deed that Blackridge is now using as a legal weapon. I think the connection between the Pruitt family and the Blackridge family goes back at least 15 years. Whether Elias Pruitt knows about it, or is actively involved in it, or is simply, he searched for the right word, a beneficiary of his father's arrangements, I don't know. Evelyn looked at her son. But it explains why Grant thinks the sheriff won't act. It might explain it, Owen said carefully. Or Grant might be right for simpler reasons. Either way, he closed the notebook. We cannot use the local sheriff. And we cannot use the county court because Blackridge's attorney is already positioned there, and Judge Hargrove, whatever his personal fairness, operates within a system that Blackridge has been cultivating for years. So we need the territorial response, Evelyn said. We need the territorial response, Owen agreed. She stood up and went to the window. Outside, the snow had settled into the particular stillness that came after a big storm, the land flattened and white and quiet, as though it needed to rest after what it had done. She stood looking at it. The letter you sent to Cheyenne, she said. How long ago? 8 weeks. Anything could have happened to it. The winter mail... I sent 3 copies, Owen said, by 3 different postriders on 3 different days, to the Territorial Attorney General, to the Territorial Governor's Land Office, and to the Federal Land Commissioner's Office in Washington. She turned from the window. Washington, she said. The Clearwater Property Trust's acquisition of federal land grants is a federal matter, Owen said, in the tone of someone quoting something he'd read and verified. If any of the ranches Blackridge acquired through the trust had homestead claims that originated as federal grants, and at least 2 of them did, according to the Courier Archive, then the fraud isn't only a territorial issue. Evelyn looked at her 13-year-old son for a long moment. You sent a letter to Washington, she said. Yes. Describing a 6-year land fraud scheme operating through a shell property trust with connections to local law enforcement going back a generation. Yes. At 13. Owen appeared faintly uncomfortable with this line of questioning. The age of the person sending the letter doesn't change the validity of the information in it. She said nothing. She sat back down at the table. She put her hands flat on it in the way she did when she was making herself be steady. We tell Grant tonight, she said. All of it. I thought you'd say that. Is there any part of this you don't want to tell him? Owen considered. The Pruitt connection is sensitive. If it reaches the wrong people before the territorial response, I know. We tell Grant and we tell no one else. Not yet. Grant took it the way Evelyn had begun to expect Grant took large things, in complete silence, with his coffee going cold in front of him, working through it at his own speed rather than performing a reaction for anyone's benefit. He read Owen's notebook pages that pertained to the findings. He went back and read 2 of them again. Then he set the notebook down and sat with his hands around the cold cup. Thomas Aldrin filed that deed, he said finally. Yes, Owen said. Blackridge's father-in-law. Yes. And Harold Pruitt accepted the filing. And was at the Blackridge winter reception 2 years before he died, Owen said, for what that's worth. Grant looked at the table. It's worth something. He turned to Evelyn. You knew about this before tonight. Since yesterday, she said. I wanted Owen to walk you through it directly. He found it. He should explain it. Grant looked at Owen. It was a long look, not assessing in the way of someone deciding whether to trust, but the look of someone who has already decided and is simply acknowledging what they're trusting. You're certain about the documents, Grant said, not guessing. I saw the original deed in the land office, Owen said. The name is on the back of it, in pencil, in a different hand from the main text. Filing officer's notation. Bertram showed me the 1871 registry that confirms Harold Pruitt was deputy recorder that year. Bertram. Grant said the name slowly. Bertram let you see the registry. He seemed... Owen searched for the right description. He seemed like a man who had known something uncomfortable for a long time and had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Grant was quiet for another moment. Then he said, Bertram has been in that office for 25 years. He was there when Harold Pruitt was deputy recorder. He paused. He may have things to say, if approached carefully. I thought the same thing, Owen said. You're 13, Grant said, not dismissively, just stating it the way you state a fact that doesn't change anything but that you need to name. I know, Owen said. How does a 13-year-old know to go looking at the back of a deed? Owen thought about it. My father used to say that documents always have a front side and a back side. The front side is what people want you to see. The back side is what happened. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that settles when someone says something that carries more weight than it was probably meant to. Grant looked at Evelyn. She looked back. "He was a wise man," Grant said. "He was," she said, "on his good days." It was Silas who asked the question nobody else had put into direct words yet. He had been listening from the doorway. Evelyn had heard him stop there, had chosen not to acknowledge it because the information needed to be said and Silas needed to hear it. And now he came into the kitchen fully and stood at the end of the table with his arms crossed. "If the sheriff is connected to Blackridge's family," Silas said, "and the county court is where Blackridge's legal claim is filed, and the county clerk's office has the original deed, then what's stopping Blackridge from making all of this disappear before the territorial response arrives?" No one answered immediately. "Nothing," Silas said. "Nothing is stopping him. Unless we move first." "We're not going to do anything illegal," Evelyn said. "I'm not talking about illegal." He looked at Owen. "The deed. The original with Pruitt's notation. It's in the land office." "Yes." "Can we get a copy of it? A legal copy?" Owen looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Grant. "Certified copies of public records," Grant said slowly, "can be requested by any party with a legal interest in the property." "You have a legal interest in the property," Silas said. "I do." "Then you request a certified copy. Tomorrow. Before anyone knows we've seen it." Grant looked at Silas for a moment with the expression he'd been wearing more frequently in the past weeks. The expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of someone younger than he'd expected to recalibrate for. "Tomorrow," Grant said. "First thing." He requested the certified copy the next morning. Bertram produced it without comment, stamped and dated, entirely legal, a perfect mirror of the original with Harold Pruitt's penciled notation preserved in the copy. Bertram's hands were steady when he handed it over, but his eyes were not quite looking at Grant, and Grant thanked him plainly and left. He brought the copy home, and Owen added it to the documentation file, which now occupied an entire section of his second notebook and a separate folder Evelyn had made from cardstock she'd bought in Crestfall. The response from Cheyenne arrived 9 days later. It came not by post, but by a man on horseback, a man in a good coat who did not have the look of the county, who had the look instead of someone who served a larger jurisdiction and knew it. He arrived at Holloway Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon and asked by name for Evelyn Cross, which meant he had been told who had initiated the correspondence, which meant at least one of Owen's 3 letters had reached someone who had read it with attention. His name was Samuel Voss. He was an investigator with the Territorial Attorney General's office, and he was 38 years old and had the face of someone who had seen enough that he no longer bothered to look surprised. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Evelyn put in front of him and read through Owen's documentation for 45 minutes without speaking. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Who compiled this?" "My son," Evelyn said. Voss looked at Owen, who was sitting at the far end of the table, notebook in hand, watching the investigator with the calm attention he gave everything. "How old are you, son?" 13, Owen said in the tone of someone who has answered this question many times recently. Voss looked back at Evelyn. "We received 3 letters. 2 reached the Attorney General's office, and 1 reached the Federal Land Commissioner's office, which is why I am here rather than simply a territorial clerk." He put his hand flat on the documentation. "This is thorough, more thorough than I expected based on the letters." "The letters were a summary," Owen said. "The documentation is the complete record." "I can see that." Voss picked up the certified copy of the 1871 deed. He looked at the Pruitt notation. He said nothing for a moment. Then carefully, "You understand that this notation, this particular piece, is sensitive." "We understand," Evelyn said. "If it reaches Blackridge before I can secure the original, we got a certified copy the morning after we found it," Grant said. "The original is still in the land office. We haven't told anyone outside this room." Voss looked at Grant. "When did you find the notation?" 10 days ago, Owen said. "And in 10 days, nothing has happened to the original in the land office." "Not that we know of," Owen said. "Although the longer we sit here, the shorter that window gets." Voss almost smiled. Not quite. "Fair point." He stood, picking up the documentation file. I need to take this with me. I'll provide you with a receipt. I'll also need sworn statements from each of you regarding the incidents of sabotage, the fence damage, the livestock poisoning, the sequence of events. We can have those written by tomorrow morning, Evelyn said. Tonight, Silas said from his place at the wall where he'd been standing since Voss arrived. Voss looked at him. Tonight, Silas said again. We don't know how long the original deed stays where it is. We don't know who in this county is talking to who. We should move as fast as we can. Voss studied him. You're the oldest. Yes. You've been doing the fence work, the cattle checks. Yes. You'll want to put in a statement about the northeast fence, the section you found cut in October, specific detail, dates, measurements, what you observed about the method of cutting. I remember all of it, Silas said. Then let's start now, Voss said and sat back down. They wrote statements until midnight. All 5 of them who were old enough to make a sworn account, Grant, Evelyn, Silas, Owen, and even Eli, who had witnessed the second fence cutting directly and whose statement Voss took with the same seriousness he'd applied to the adults, which Eli would remember for the rest of his life. Caleb, at 8, was not asked for a statement, but he sat at the table the entire time with the gravity of someone who understood that something important was happening and wanted to be present for it. Voss rode out before dawn with the documentation and the statements and the certified copy of the 1871 deed. He told them he would be in contact through the Laramie mail route, which was more reliable than Crestfall's post, and that they should expect either a message or a return visit within 3 weeks. He also told them, at the door, to be careful. Blackridge doesn't know what you have, he said, but he knows something shifted. Men like him can feel it. They've survived long enough by sensing when the situation changes. He'll move against us, Grant said. Probably, Voss said. Keep documenting. Don't retaliate. Don't give him anything that looks like aggression on your part. He paused. You've been doing all of that already. Keep doing it. He rode into the dark. The 3 weeks that followed were the most difficult of all of them, because they were weeks of waiting, and waiting with the knowledge that something was moving, that invisible gears were turning somewhere in Cheyenne and Washington, while on the ground everything continued to grind and press and wear at them. Blackridge's campaign shifted. He had apparently sensed, as Voss had predicted, that something had changed. The fence cutting stopped, abruptly, completely, as if a signal had been given. The water contamination stopped. The physical sabotage simply ceased, and the silence it left was more unsettling than the damage had been, because at least the damage was legible. The silence could mean anything. What replaced it was social and legal and economic, and in some ways those were harder to fight. 3 of the Crestfall merchants who had previously extended credit to Holloway Ranch quietly withdrew it within the same week. No explanations. Just letters of regret delivered by the same post on the same day, which was not a coincidence and was not meant to look like one. The message was clear. Blackridge's influence was reminding people which side of this dispute it was safer to be on. The county court sent a notice that the property dispute hearing had been rescheduled to February, sooner than expected, earlier than Arthur Kane had anticipated when he'd written from Laramie. Blackridge's attorney had apparently filed a motion for expedited consideration, citing the ongoing uncertainty as harmful to county land records. Judge Hargrove had granted it. February is 6 weeks away, Grant said, looking at the notice. Kane needs to be here before then, Evelyn said. I'll write to him today. Already done, she said. She had written to Arthur Kane 3 days ago when she had first sensed the campaign shifting, because she had learned to stay one step ahead of the next thing rather than responding to the last thing. I told him February. He wrote back 2 days ago. She produced Kane's letter from her coat pocket and put it on the table. He arrives the 2nd week of January. Grant picked up the letter, read it, put it down, looked at her. You've been managing things, he said. Yes, without telling me. I was going to tell you today. She met his eyes. I'm not keeping things from you. I'm trying not to put incomplete information in front of you when I can make it complete first. I said the same thing to you once, he said. About the fence, early on. She remembered. I know, I'm doing it better than you did. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Grant Holloway's face did not move easily towards smiling, but the shape that preceded one, the structural possibility of it. Probably true, he said. Margaret Hale came calling again in January. This time she came alone and did not bring food, which Evelyn took as a sign that this visit was different from the last one. She sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on and her hands around a cup she'd barely touched, and looked like a woman who had decided to say something difficult and was managing the approach to it. Evelyn waited. "My husband received a letter from Blackridge," Margaret said finally, "offering to purchase our eastern 20 acres. At a fair price, she paused, above what we'd expect." "He's consolidating," Evelyn said. "Yes." Margaret looked at her cup. "Elias, my husband, he's tempted. We've had 2 hard years and the offer is genuine money and—" She stopped. "But I've been watching what's happened to you, and I've been thinking about things I didn't want to think about before." "What kind of things?" Margaret looked up. "The Berrymans? Do you know who they were?" Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "I've heard the name. They were good people. Came here in '79. Frank Berryman and his wife, 3 daughters. They had the land north of what's now Blackridge's main holding." She wrapped her hands around the cup she wasn't drinking. "They left in '82. Just left. One day they were here and then they weren't. Frank never said goodbye to anyone. His wife didn't come to the church one last time, didn't—" She shook her head. "Everybody said they just decided to move on. Wyoming was hard. Some people weren't cut out for it. That's what everyone said." "What do you think?" "I think," Margaret said quietly, "that Frank Berryman was a proud man who did not leave anywhere without saying goodbye. And I think now, watching what's happening to you, that I was wrong not to ask more questions in 1882. Evelyn looked at her. At the cost on her face of saying this, the particular weight of someone reckoning with a regret they'd been carrying for years without naming it. "Would your husband speak to someone from the Territorial Attorney General's office?" Evelyn asked. Margaret's eyes went still. "You've already contacted them." "Weeks ago." A long pause. Margaret looked at the window, at the cold outside. "Elias won't be happy," she said. "I know. He's practical about things, about the way power works out here. He doesn't think of himself as a coward. He just thinks of himself as a realist." "I'm not asking him to be a hero," Evelyn said. "I'm asking him to tell the truth to a person with the authority to act on it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll talk to him." She left without finishing her coffee. Evelyn watched her go and did not let herself calculate the odds of Elias Hale actually agreeing, because calculating odds was Owen's work, and her own work was different. Her own work was to keep the door open and trust that people sometimes walked through doors when they were ready. Arthur Kane arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of January, which was colder than anything Evelyn had encountered in Missouri, and which Kane, who was from Laramie and therefore accustomed to cold, treated as entirely unremarkable. He was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard maintained with evident precision and eyes that moved quickly over everything in a room. He shook Grant's hand and then Evelyn's, and when he shook Evelyn's, he held it for an extra second and said, "Your correspondence is the clearest I've received in 20 years of practice." "Thank you," she said. "It's not entirely a compliment," he said. "Clear correspondence means clear thinking, and clear thinking about a situation like this one means you understood how serious it was. I'm sorry you were in it long enough to understand that." She liked him immediately. He spent 2 days at the ranch reviewing everything: Owen's full documentation, the certified copy of the 1871 deed, the sworn statements, the records of the Clearwater Property Trust acquisitions, Voss's receipt for the documentation he'd taken. He asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable, including several directed at Owen that Owen answered with such exactitude that Kane stopped partway through one answer and looked at Evelyn and said, "Does he have someone to study under? Because he should." "He's working on it," Evelyn said, and Owen made a note. On the second evening, Kane laid out their position at the kitchen table with everyone present, which was his own decision. He had asked before he began whether everyone should be present, and Evelyn had said yes, and he had nodded as though he'd expected that answer. The property claim, Kane said, was winnable. The 1871 conditional transfer deed was legally inert because the conditions had not been met within the required period, and he could demonstrate this with the original territorial land statutes from 1871, which he had brought with him. The Pruitt connection was significant, but needed to be handled through Voss's investigation rather than the county proceeding, because introducing it in a county court before the territorial investigation was complete would give Blackridge's attorneys grounds to allege improper procedural conduct and potentially delay everything. "So we don't use the Pruitt material at the county hearing," Silas said. "Not yet," Kane said. "And the other ranches, the Clearwater acquisitions?" "Voss is building that case," Kane said, "which means we need to not disrupt it by moving too fast on any single piece." "Blackridge moved the hearing up," Grant said. "February. He's the one moving fast." "I know." Kane looked at his papers. "Which is why I'm going to file for a continuance tomorrow morning, citing the territorial investigation as grounds for postponement. Hargrove may not grant it, but it puts the existence of the territorial investigation on record, which limits what Blackridge's attorneys can do without risking obstruction of a higher authority proceeding." The room was quiet for a moment. "You're using the investigation as a shield," Owen said. "Partly," Kane said, "and as a lever. Yes." Owen made a note. The continuance was not granted. Hargrove cited the legitimate burden of the unresolved property claim on county records, language that had the feel of something written for him, in Evelyn's opinion, and set the February date as final. Kane received the ruling by post and came back to Crestfall 2 days before the hearing with 2 junior attorneys and a document case so full it took 2 men to carry it. In the days before the hearing, 2 things happened that nobody had planned for. The first was Bertram. He came to the ranch on a Sunday afternoon, which was the last day anyone expected a county clerk to make an unannounced visit. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands and his color slightly heightened, the look of a man who has been working up to something for a long time. Grant let him in. Bertram sat at the table. He refused coffee. He put both hands flat on the table in the manner of someone who needed the physical contact with a solid surface. "I've been in that office since 1868, he said. "I know every document in it. I know how they were filed, and when, and by who." Nobody said anything. "I was there in 1871, he said. "I was junior to Harold Pruitt. I was 23. He looked at his hands. "Harold Pruitt accepted that deed. I saw him accept it. I saw him write his name on the back." He paused. "I also saw who brought it in." "Victor Blackridge," Grant said. "His father," Bertram said, "Robert Blackridge, with Thomas Aldrin. They came together." He looked up. "I have known for 15 years that deed was a setup, something to sit in the records and wait. And I didn't say anything because Harold Pruitt was the senior man, and he told me it was legitimate business, and I was 23, and I—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I didn't say anything." Evelyn looked at him, at the weight of 15 years of silence on his face. "Will you say something now?" she asked. "I'll put it in writing," Bertram said. "Whatever you need. A sworn statement, testimony, whatever Kane needs." "You know Arthur Kane?" Grant asked. "By reputation. He's a fair man." Bertram finally picked up the coffee he'd refused. "More to the point, he's from Laramie and he doesn't owe anything to anyone in Crestfall." He gave his statement that afternoon. Kane, reached by urgent rider, sent word that Bertram's testimony was the strongest piece they now had, not because the document evidence wasn't sufficient, but because a county official of 25 years standing who had personally witnessed the original filing destroyed any possible defense that the deed was innocent. The second thing that happened was the Hales. Elias Hale arrived 2 days before the hearing, not with Margaret, alone, and hitched his horse at the gate and walked to the door and knocked. Silas answered and looked at him with the expression that Silas wore when he was deciding something, and then stepped back and let him in. Elias Hale was a large man going soft around the middle, with the look of someone who had once been capable of great physical effort and now directed that energy into worry. He sat at the table and was plainly miserable, which Evelyn found made her more sympathetic to him, not less. "My wife told me to come," he said, as if that required acknowledgement. I know, Evelyn said. She said, he stopped. She said you didn't need a hero, just someone who'd tell the truth. That's what I said. He looked at the table. We had trouble in 81. Not as bad as what you've had, or what the Berrymans had, but I knew what it was. I knew where it was coming from. And I took Blackridge's offer for the piece of land he wanted, and I told myself I was being practical. Nobody responded. He's been at me again, Elias said. The eastern 20 acres. And I came here to... He stopped again. I'm not a coward. I want that on record. I just thought there wasn't any way to fight it. There is now, Grant said. Hale looked at him. You sure about that? Grant looked back at him steadily. Not entirely, but more sure than I've been in 4 years. Hale gave a short sound that was not quite a laugh. I'll testify, he said, to what happened in 81. What I know about how it happened, what I was told. He looked at Evelyn. I can't give you the Berrymans. I don't know what happened to them, and I won't pretend I do. What you know is enough, Evelyn said. Margaret thinks so, he said. I'm inclined to believe her. The hearing was on a Thursday at 10 in the morning in the Crestfall County Courthouse, and every person in a 50-mile radius who had any reason to care about land, power, or the question of whether Victor Blackridge was untouchable seemed to have found a way to be in that room. It was standing only inside, and there were people on the boardwalk outside pressing against the windows, which Judge Hargrove regarded with the look of a man who had not bargained on this level of audience, and was uncertain how to feel about it. Blackridge sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 attorneys and the composed confidence of a man who had won every version of this situation before. He did not look at Grant. He looked at Evelyn once, briefly, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there in the general store, something that might have been recalculation, quickly smoothed over. Kane opened by filing the certified copy of the 1871 deed, the full documentation of the conditional transfer statutes, and a 10-page brief demonstrating in precise legal language that the deed was inert. Blackridge's lead attorney objected immediately, citing the chain of title as the relevant issue rather than the original conditions. Hargrove looked at Kane's brief. He read the relevant section of the 1871 statutes, which Kane had helpfully marked with a paper tab. He asked 2 questions, both procedural. Kane answered them. Then Kane called Bertram. Bertram walked to the front of the room with the posture of a man who has made a decision he intends to live with and is no longer interested in the comfort of the alternative. He sat. He was sworn. Kane asked him to describe what he had personally witnessed on the date of the deed's filing in 1871. Blackridge's attorney was on his feet before Bertram had finished the first sentence. The objection was procedural, witness not disclosed in pre-hearing filings, and it was technically valid, and Hargrove sustained it, and the room went tight. Kane did not lose his composure. He requested a 1-day continuance to properly disclose Bertram as a witness and file his statement into the record. Hargrove looked at Blackridge's table, at the 2 attorneys conferring rapidly in low voices, at Blackridge himself, whose face had done something, not much, just something, at Bertram's name. Granted, Hargrove said. We reconvene Friday morning at 9. 1 day. Outside afterward, on the boardwalk, Kane said quietly to Grant and Evelyn, he'll spend tonight trying to discredit Bertram. Find something in his record, anything. We need Bertram somewhere safe, and we need his statement airtight by morning. He can stay at the ranch, Grant said immediately. He'll need to agree to that. I'll ask him, Evelyn said. She was already moving. She found Bertram coming down the courthouse steps, hat in hand, looking like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was not yet sure whether he'd land. Come to the ranch tonight, she said. He looked at her. I figured there might be trouble. There might be. Come anyway. He thought about it for perhaps 3 seconds. All right, he said. Let me get my coat. That night the ranch was full in a way it had not been before. Bertram at the table across from Kane, papers between them, going through the statement line by line. Owen taking his own notes in the corner because Kane had, by this point, given up on asking him not to. Elias Hale arriving unexpectedly at 8 o'clock with Margaret, and the information that someone had come to his ranch that afternoon, asking questions about his relationship with Bertram, which had confirmed for him that the right choice and the dangerous choice were the same choice, and he'd decided to make it. Silas sat with Grant on the porch for a while in the cold, not talking much. The stars were the particular cold, clear Wyoming stars, too many to count and too bright to ignore. "Tomorrow," Silas said. "Tomorrow," Grant said. "Win or lose." "Win or lose," Grant said. "Although," he paused, "I've stopped believing we're going to lose." "When did you stop believing that?" Grant thought about it honestly. "Somewhere around the time your mother told me to write the letter to Laramie." Silas looked out at the dark land. At the property line he'd walked 100 times, in snow and cold and wind, checking the fences that kept being cut and fixing them and checking them again. At the outbuildings he'd helped repair, and the barn he'd come to know by its sounds at different hours, and the cattle he'd learned to count by sight in the way you learn things by just doing them enough times. "It's a good ranch," Silas said. He said it without sentimentality, as a statement of fact. "It is," Grant said. "We made it better." "You did," Grant said. "All of you." He was quiet for a moment. "Your family made it something I couldn't have made alone." Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked at the stars. "You're not alone anymore," he said finally. He said it like a fact, not a gift, a simple statement of the current condition of things. Then he stood up and went inside because it was cold and because he had said the thing and didn't need to stay standing in the cold after saying it. Grant sat on the porch alone for a few more minutes. The land was dark and quiet and entirely his. For one more night, at least, it was entirely his. And he thought about Martha, briefly, the way he thought about her when the land was quiet. He thought she would have had things to say about all of this. She always had things to say. He thought she would probably have liked every one of them. He went inside. The Friday morning hearing began at 9 o'clock, with every seat in the courthouse filled, and people standing 3 deep along the back wall, which Judge Hargrove regarded with the expression of a man who had accepted that this day was going to be unlike his usual Fridays, and had made his peace with it. Bertram had slept at the ranch. He had eaten breakfast with all of them at the kitchen table. A quiet meal, not uncomfortable. The quiet of people who had said what needed saying and were now simply waiting for the day to begin. Evelyn had watched him eat and thought about what it cost a man to carry 15 years of silence into a courthouse and put it down on a table in front of everyone. She thought it cost more than most people would be willing to pay, and she thought that the fact that he was paying it anyway was worth acknowledging, even if she didn't say so out loud. Kane had Bertram's statement properly filed by 8:30. Blackridge's attorneys had apparently spent the night doing exactly what Kane had predicted, looking for something in Bertram's record to use, and had found nothing useful because Bertram's 25 years in the county clerk's office were characterized entirely by the kind of unremarkable competence that gives no purchase to attack. He was simply a man who had shown up and done his job correctly for a very long time, and you cannot undermine that with a night's worth of searching. Bertram took the witness position and gave his statement in the flat, careful voice of a man who had rehearsed it enough that the emotion was contained but not hidden. He described what he had seen in 1871. He described Robert Blackridge and Thomas Aldrin arriving together with the conditional transfer deed. He described Harold Pruitt accepting the filing. He described the conversation he had partially heard, which included language about the deed being held in reserve. Those were the words he remembered, held in reserve, for future use regarding the Holloway land parcel, which at that time was not yet owned by Grant Holloway, but was anticipated to be acquired by a specific buyer whose name Bertram had not heard. Blackridge's lead attorney cross-examined him for 40 minutes. He was skilled, and Bertram was not a trained legal witness, and there were moments when the questioning found gaps in Bertram's memory that were real. 15 years was a long time, and memory did what memory did. But the core of what Bertram had seen did not move. The deed, the men, the conversation, the words held in reserve, those stayed exactly where he had put them. When the cross-examination finished, Hargrove looked at his papers for a long moment. Then he looked at the room. "I'm going to take a brief recess," he said. In the hallway outside, Kane stood with Grant and Evelyn and said quietly, "Hargrove is a fair man." "You've said that before," Grant said. "I keep saying it because I keep believing it," Kane said. What Bertram gave him is enough to invalidate the deed on its own terms. The conditional transfer was held in reserve. Those are Bertram's words from direct observation, which means the conditions were never intended to be met. It was a planted document. Hargrove knows what that means legally. What does it mean legally? Evelyn asked. It means the deed is not just inert, Kane said. It means it was fraudulent in its original intent, which changes the nature of Blackridge's claim from a contested property dispute to something considerably more serious. Evelyn looked at the courthouse door. Through it, she could hear the low sound of the crowd inside, the particular noise of a lot of people trying to be quiet. Will Hargrove say that today? She asked. I don't know, Kane said honestly. He may rule on the property claim and let the fraud question go to the territorial proceeding. That would be the careful move. The careful move protects Blackridge, Silas said. He had been standing slightly behind Evelyn, arms crossed, and had said nothing since the recess was called. The careful move protects the ruling from appeal, Kane said. There's a difference. A ruling on the property claim that Hargrove makes bulletproof is worth more to us than a broader ruling that Blackridge's attorneys can challenge for procedural errors. Silas absorbed this. He didn't like it, which showed on his face, but he absorbed it. Hargrove came back in 20 minutes. He sat. He arranged his papers with the methodical care of a man who had made a decision and was organizing himself around it. He ruled that the 1871 conditional transfer deed was legally inoperative under the territorial land statutes in effect at the time of filing, as the conditions specified had not been met within the required period, and as newly submitted testimony indicated the deed had been filed with the explicit intent of deferring its use beyond the statutory window, which constituted an improper use of the recording mechanism. He dismissed Blackridge's property claim in its entirety. He also noted, for the record, that the testimony presented raised questions of potential fraudulent filing that fell outside the jurisdiction of the county court and would be referred to the appropriate territorial authority. He said this last part looking not at Blackridge's table but at the room in general, and the room received it the way rooms receive things they have been waiting to hear, not with noise exactly, but with a collective release of held breath that was almost audible. Blackridge sat at his table and did not move for a moment. His face did not change in any dramatic way. He was too practiced for that. What changed was something around the edges. The precise confidence that had been in his posture since the proceeding began was no longer there, and what replaced it was a kind of stillness that was different from composure. He looked at Evelyn as he stood to leave. She looked back at him. She did not look away, and neither did he. For a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then he turned and walked out with his attorneys, and the room broke into sound. Outside in the cold, Grant shook Kane's hand and said thank you and meant it, and Kane said the work had been mostly done before he arrived, which was generous and also largely true. Elias Hale, who had sat through the entire proceeding in the third row with Margaret's hand on his arm, came out onto the boardwalk and shook Grant's hand without saying much, because he was not a man who said much, but the handshake was the kind that communicates what words are too small for. Silas was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, looking up the main street of Crestfall, when Evelyn came to stand beside him. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and his face was doing the complicated internal processing he always did when something he'd been bracing against for a long time had finally resolved. "It's done," he said. "The property claim is done," she said. "The rest will take longer." "I know." He looked at her sideways. "Are you all right?" She thought about that question for a moment, took it seriously, the way he deserved. "I'm more than all right," she said. "I'm tired, and I'd like a hot meal, and my feet hurt from these boots. But yes, more than all right." Something in his face loosened, just slightly. "Good," he said. Owen appeared from inside, notebook already open. "Hargrove's referral to the territorial authority. That's Voss's investigation. That referral makes it official. Blackridge can't claim it's an informal proceeding anymore." "I know, Owen," Evelyn said. "It also means any interference with the investigation going forward is—" "Owen," Silas said. "Give it 10 minutes." Owen looked at him, closed the notebook. 10 minutes, he agreed, and went to find Eli. What came in the weeks following the ruling was not clean or simple, because nothing about dismantling something a man had spent 20 years building was going to be clean or simple. Voss came back in March with 2 other investigators from the territorial office, and they spent 2 weeks in Crestfall reviewing records, interviewing witnesses, and making the kind of deliberate, thorough work of it that actual justice usually required. The Clearwater Property Trust was the center of it. Once Voss had the documentation Owen had assembled, combined with Bertram's testimony and the certified deed, the pattern was not hard to trace. It was only hard to trace if you weren't looking, and now there were people who were very specifically looking. The 3 ranches that had sold to the trust were examined. 2 of the former owners were located, one in Colorado, one in Nebraska, and both came forward to describe what had happened to them. The Berryman family, it turned out, had relocated to Oregon, and Frank Berryman's daughter, now grown, wrote a letter to the territorial office that Voss described to Evelyn as one of the most detailed accounts of systematic intimidation he had received in 15 years of investigative work. James Aldrin, Blackridge's brother-in-law and the principal officer of the Clearwater Property Trust, was the first to break. He had apparently been anticipating exactly this moment for some time. Men who operate as the functional layer beneath a larger predator often have a well-developed sense of when the structure above them is failing, and he came forward voluntarily with records that documented, in his own meticulous accounting, every transaction the trust had made, every instruction he had received from Blackridge, and the financial arrangements that had compensated the various county officials involved over the years. Harold Pruitt's estate was not recoverable. He was dead and had been for 3 years. But what Aldrin's records revealed about Elias Pruitt was more nuanced than Owen had expected. Elias Pruitt had known about his father's arrangement with Blackridge. He had received one payment in 1883 to look the other direction on a specific incident involving the Harker Ranch that had been listed in the Courier Archive as accidental fire. After that single payment, he had refused further involvement, which was why, Grant reflected, the sheriff had seemed genuinely limited in his response to Holloway Ranch's situation rather than actively obstructive. He had not been working for Blackridge. He had been working for his own conscience, which had told him to stay out of it, which was a different and smaller kind of wrong, but a wrong nonetheless. Elias Pruitt resigned the sheriff's position in April. He did it quietly, with a letter to the county board that cited personal reasons, and he and his family left Crestfall before the summer. Owen noted this in his records without editorial comment, which was its own form of editorial comment. Victor Blackridge was formally charged by the territorial authority in May with fraud, conspiracy to defraud, improper use of public land records, and 3 counts of witness intimidation going back to the Harker Ranch fire. His attorneys were good, and the process was slow, the way territorial legal processes were always slow, and he was not immediately imprisoned. But his influence in Crestfall collapsed with a speed that surprised even people who had been expecting it, because that was how influence worked when it was built on fear. It did not fade gradually, it fell all at once, the moment people understood that the fear was no longer warranted. The merchants who had withdrawn credit from Holloway Ranch came back, one by one. None of them said anything about why they had left or why they were returning, and Evelyn accepted them back without comment because she was a practical woman and the ranch needed supplies more than it needed apologies. Margaret Hale brought a dish of food the week after the territorial charges were announced and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and talked about everything except what had happened, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, and Evelyn made coffee and let her talk. Ruth Hadley at the Crestfall Courier ran 4 consecutive front-page stories on the Blackridge investigation, each one more detailed than the last, citing the territorial authorities' public filings. The 4th story mentioned Owen by name, the 13-year-old son of Evelyn Cross, whose documentation of the pattern of property acquisitions is credited by territorial investigators as instrumental to opening the case, which Owen read once and then set down without expression, though Eli announced to everyone at dinner that evening that his brother was famous, and Owen told him to stop, and Silas told him to stop, and Caleb asked what famous meant, and nobody answered him satisfactorily. The ranch itself had been changing since February in ways that were quieter than the legal proceedings, but perhaps more lasting. The fences were solid, all of them, every section, because Silas had spent the winter making certain of it, and there was something in the way he walked the fence line now. That was different from how he'd walked it in the fall, not watchful in the fearful way. Watchful in the way of someone who knows what he's responsible for and has decided to be responsible for it. Grant had been teaching him. Not formally, not with announced lessons, but in the way that real teaching happened on working land, alongside repetition, occasional correction, the transfer of knowledge that happened when someone let you make mistakes, and then showed you what you'd done without making the mistake the point. Silas had been learning the cattle, the pasture rotation, the way to read the land in different seasons. He had been learning it the way he learned everything he decided was worth learning, which was completely. One evening in late April, Grant came in from the east section and found Silas already there, having finished the check, feeding information to the notation system Owen had developed for tracking the herd. Grant looked at the notation, at the number Silas had entered. "You caught the issue with the 2 yearlings," he said. "They were favoring the same leg on the same side," Silas said. "Water trough placement. I moved it." Grant looked at him. "How long have you been watching them?" 3 days. I wanted to be sure before I moved anything." A pause. "That's the right call." "I know," Silas said. Not arrogantly, just certainly. Grant sat down at the table. He looked at the notation book, which had been Owen's idea and had become one of the more useful things on the ranch. Then he said without particular ceremony, "I want to talk to you about the future of this property." Silas looked up. "Not today, and not tomorrow," Grant said. "But in the next few years, when you're of age, when you know the land the way you need to know it, I want you to have a formal stake in this ranch." He said it the way he said everything important, which was without ornamentation. Not as charity, as a working share for a man who's earned it. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "That's not something to answer tonight," Grant said. "No," Silas said. "I know." He looked back at the notation book. "I won't say no." Grant nodded once. That was enough. The conversation Grant needed to have with Evelyn was harder to start, which he was aware of, which made him delay it in the way men delayed things that felt irreversible. It was not that he didn't know what he wanted to say. He had known for some time, probably since the blizzard, probably since that morning she had held the calf steady in the barn and asked if Martha would have liked them and had not looked away from his answer. He had known it the way you knew things that you had not let yourself name yet, because naming them made them real, and real things could be lost. He found her in the garden in May. She had started a kitchen garden in March, which nobody had specifically told her to do. It had just appeared, the way Evelyn's improvements tended to appear, already half done by the time anyone noticed them. It was a practical garden, not a decorative one. Vegetables in straight rows, spaced correctly, with the particular competence of someone who had grown things before and knew what she was doing. She was crouched over a row of seedlings when he came out, and she looked up at him with the expression she wore when she was in the middle of something and was deciding whether to stop. She stood up. He said, "I need to ask you something." "All right." He had thought about how to say it for weeks and had not arrived at anything elegant, which was probably appropriate because elegant was not what this was. This was two people who had come to each other through loss and difficulty and the specific test of a year that had tried very hard to break them, and it deserved the same honesty that had started it. The letter that had said, "I am not an easy man, and I am writing because your letter sounded like someone telling the truth." "I don't want this to be a practical arrangement anymore," he said. "It hasn't been one for a long time. I think you know that." She looked at him. The spring light was doing what spring light did, and the garden smelled like turned earth and possibility, and none of that was the point. "I do know that," she said. "I want to ask you." He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking because I'm afraid of being alone, or because the ranch needs something, or for any of the reasons we both started this for. I'm asking because," he looked at her steadily, "because I want to. Because you are the most capable and honest and sometimes unreasonably stubborn person I have shared this land with, and I would like to keep sharing it with you, for the right reasons." She was quiet for a moment. He waited because he had learned that she needed to finish thinking before she talked, and that her silence was not uncertainty, but process. "You called me stubborn," she said. "I did. In a proposal." "I did. That's..." She paused. "That's actually very accurate." He waited. "I have 4 sons," she said. "I know. I've met them. I like them." "Silas will test you for the rest of your life." "Silas already has. I don't mind it. Owen will want to be involved in every decision regarding the property. Owen is usually right about the decisions. I don't see the problem. Eli will break things. Eli fixes things faster than he breaks them. Balance. Caleb, she stopped, and something shifted in her face. The particular softness that came when she got to Caleb, her youngest, her easy one, the one who made friends with everyone and cried at small injustices and had told a complete stranger on a train that he was sorry about their dog. Caleb will love you without condition, and that will scare you. Grant was quiet for a beat. It already does, he said. He already does. He paused. I think I'd like to deserve it. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had written, I am not an easy man, and had then proceeded to prove it in the most inconvenient possible way, by actually meaning it, by being exactly as difficult and honest and unexpectedly decent as advertised. Yes, she said. It was not a complicated yes. It was not followed by anything dramatic. She said it, and he nodded, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the May morning, and neither of them had anything to add, which was fine because it was already everything. They were married in June by a justice of the peace in Crestfall, in a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes and was attended by Kane, Voss, the Hales, Ruth Hadley, Bertram, and all 4 crossboys who had varying relationships with the concept of wearing their good shirts. Caleb cried, which nobody was surprised by. Eli tried to get the justice of the peace to let him say something, and was redirected by Silas without incident. Owen took notes, which was unusual for a wedding and entirely predictable for Owen. Silas stood at Grant's left during the ceremony with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into something that was not quite neutral. It was something more than that, some careful opening in the expression of a boy who had been protecting himself and his family for a long time and was learning slowly and at his own pace that protection did not always have to come from bracing against things. Sometimes it came from choosing what to trust. He shook Grant's hand afterward. Not a boy's handshake, a man's, firm and deliberate. Grant held it for a moment. I know this isn't simple, he said quietly, under the noise of the others. No, Silas said. I'm not trying to replace anything. I know you're not. Silas looked at him. You don't have to explain yourself. You've been showing us who you are since October. He paused. I trust what I've seen. Grant nodded. That's enough for me, Silas said, and went to help Caleb, who had gotten his good shirt caught on the fence post outside the justice's office, which was exactly the kind of thing Caleb managed to do at important moments. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that a working ranch produced when the people on it were no longer spending their energy fighting something external and could direct it instead into the land itself. The vegetable garden came in fully. The herd numbers climbed back to where they'd been before Blackridge's campaign had depleted them. The south barn roof, which had needed replacing since before the Cross family arrived, and which Grant had been managing around rather than fixing, because managing around things alone was cheaper than fixing them, was replaced properly, with Silas and Eli doing most of the physical work, while Grant directed and Owen calculated load distributions for the new beams, which Eli initially thought was unnecessary until one of Owen's calculations prevented a section from collapsing on a Sunday afternoon, after which Eli did not question the calculations. Caleb turned 9 in July and requested a dog for his birthday, which request was granted through the acquisition of a 6-week-old cattle dog from the Hale Ranch's newest litter, a small, fierce animal that Caleb named Compass, and that immediately bonded with Grant in the particular way of animals that recognize the person least likely to spoil them and decides that is the safest attachment. Caleb was philosophical about this. He loves me the most, he explained to anyone who suggested otherwise. He just shows it to Grant. Owen received a letter in August from Arthur Kane that contained a referral to a law office in Laramie, whose senior partner was known for taking exceptional apprentices. Kane had apparently written to them on Owen's behalf, describing the Blackridge documentation in detail, and noting that the 14-year-old who had compiled it had demonstrated an analytical capacity that Kane had not encountered outside of formal legal training. The letter from the Laramie office invited Owen to write to them directly, describing his interest and background. Owen wrote the letter in one evening. He showed it to Evelyn before he sent it. She read it and handed it back. "Send it," she said. "You think they'll take me?" "I think anyone who reads this letter and doesn't respond isn't a law office worth going to." He sent it. The response came in September, and it contained an offer of apprenticeship beginning the following spring, conditional on continued study through the winter. Owen read the letter at the kitchen table and then looked up with the expression of someone whose internal calculation has just resolved into exactly the number it was supposed to. "I'll have to leave in the spring," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "The ranch will be down a person." "The ranch will manage. Silas can maintain the documentation system, but he should cross-reference the herd rotation records weekly rather than—" "Owen," she put her hand on his, "we will manage. You go." He nodded. Then, in an entirely un-Owen moment, he put his other hand on top of hers and left it there for a moment before going back to his notebook, and she thought, "There he is, my boy." The territorial case against Victor Blackridge concluded in the fall. It did not conclude quickly or dramatically. These things never did, because real justice was slow and procedural and deeply unglamorous compared to the speed of the harm that had made it necessary. But it concluded completely. Blackridge was found liable for fraud in 3 separate property transactions, conspiracy to defraud in the broader pattern of Clearwater Trust acquisitions, and 1 count of witness intimidation in connection with the Harker Ranch fire of 1880. The civil penalties stripped the Clearwater Property Trust of its holdings, which were to be returned to the original sellers or their families at assessed value. The criminal charges carried a sentence that Blackridge's attorneys were still contesting at the end of the year, but the appeals were running out of ground. James Aldrin, who had cooperated fully, received a reduced penalty and relocated his family to Colorado, which was far enough to represent a clean break from everything the Blackridge name had built in Wyoming. Voss came to the ranch one last time in October to close out the documentation file and deliver the formal notification that Holloway Ranch's ownership was confirmed, clear, and uncontested in the territorial land record. He sat at the kitchen table one more time with his coffee and looked at the family assembled there. Grant, Evelyn, all 4 boys, the dog in the corner, and said, "I want you to know that this case changed how we approach land fraud investigations in this territory. The methodology of documentation you used," he looked at Owen, "is being adopted as a standard." Owen did not look as gratified as everyone expected him to. He looked instead thoughtful. "Then it should be published," he said, "a clear guide to how to document systematic property fraud. So the next family that faces something like this doesn't have to invent the method themselves." Voss looked at him. "You could write that." "I intend to," Owen said, "when I'm at Laramie." Voss smiled, a real one, the first Evelyn had seen on him. "I'll look for it," he said. What had been Holloway Ranch was still called Holloway Ranch. That had been Evelyn's own preference because the name had been on the land before they arrived and would outlast all of them. And there was something right about that, about the continuity of a name through the people who came to love the place it belonged to. But the ranch itself had become something that the name alone could not entirely contain anymore. It had become the Hales' nearest neighbor in the real sense of the word. Not just geographically, but in the way that mattered, the way that meant you helped each other in bad weather, and argued and made up and fed each other's animals when someone was sick. It had become Ruth Hadley's most reliable story source, which Ruth was honest enough to acknowledge. It had become the place that other families in the county pointed to, quietly or not so quietly, when they needed to remember that what looked like an impossible situation could, if you were willing to do the patient and unglamorous work of it, become something else. None of them were unchanged by what the year had cost. That would have been too easy, and nothing about this had been easy, and Evelyn had learned long ago to be suspicious of anything that looked like it had come without cost. Silas carried the weight of having had to choose patience over instinct for months, and that weight had shaped him, made him more considered, but also more aware of his own anger in ways that would take years to fully understand. Owen carried the knowledge of how systems failed and who they failed, and he was going to carry that into whatever he built with his life, which was probably going to make him a difficult but necessary presence in whatever room he occupied. Eli carried the particular scar of a winter where he had been braver than he'd known he could be, and had discovered that bravery was not the absence of fear, but just what happened when you went anyway. Caleb had compass and the ranch, and a growing understanding that the world contained people who would try to take things from others, and that there were also people who would stand in the way of that, and that the second kind of people needed to eat dinner. Grant carried Martha the way he would always carry her, not as grief that prevented him from living, but as the permanent presence of someone who had shaped him into the person capable of receiving this new life. Evelyn understood that because she carried Daniel the same way, not in front of everything, but beneath it, the foundation of her without being the structure. And Evelyn herself carried what the year had given her, which was the specific knowledge that she had not broken when everything had tried to break her. Not because she was stronger than other people, not because she was smarter or more capable, but because she had done the next thing and then the next thing and then the next thing, and had let her children do the same, and had trusted the work rather than waiting for some larger guarantee that the work would matter. It had mattered. On an evening in late October, when the aspen had gone the particular gold that Wyoming produced as though it was apologizing for the winter ahead, Evelyn stood on the porch of the house and watched the light change over the land. Grant came out and stood beside her, and they were quiet together in the way they had become quiet together. Not the silence of strangers, not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the particular silence of two people who had learned each other well enough that silence was no longer empty. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "Tell me." "That letter you wrote, the one that answered the advertisement." She looked at the land. "You wrote that you weren't writing because you felt sorry for me." "I remember." "I read that line 6 times. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because everyone else was sorry for me," she said. "The neighbors, the bank, the people at the boarding house, they were all very sorry, and being felt sorry for—" She paused. "It makes you smaller. Every time someone pities you, you have to work to stay the same size." He was quiet. "You didn't do that," she said. "You just said you needed what I had. People with something to offer and work to do." She turned to look at him. "Do you know how long it had been since someone needed what I had, instead of feeling sorry that I had it?" He looked at her. The light was going gold and then amber, and then something deeper, the way it did out here, the way she had come to depend on. "I needed all of it," he said. "I needed every one of you. I just didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was asking too much." "You weren't asking too much," she said. "No," he agreed. "It turned out I wasn't." Inside the house, Caleb was telling a story at the top of his volume to anyone who would listen, and Eli was intermittently responding, and somewhere upstairs Silas and Owen were having the low measured argument they had at least twice a week about something that sounded trivial and was usually significant. The dog barked once at something outside, and then was quiet. The land lay out before them in the evening light, wide and particular and hard and genuinely beautiful. The kind of beautiful that asked something of you rather than simply presenting itself. And they stood on the porch of the house that had become a home and watched it in the way of people who knew the cost of what they had and were not going to make the mistake of taking it for granted. They had not built a perfect life. They had built a true one, which was harder and lasted longer and meant something that perfect never could. The winter was coming. There would be work and difficulty and the ordinary accumulation of days that were sometimes good and sometimes not and had to be lived through regardless. They were going to live through them together. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.